His last words to his family were not emotional, they were calculated. 3 days means a rest. 7 days means I will not return. While the military consolidated power behind closed doors, one man chose resistance over silence. In Bangkok, that choice carried consequences few survived. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the vanishing voice, the Tanong Poearen case. Now let's begin. Some men vanish into legend. Others are erased by design. When a voice grows too loud, when truth becomes inconvenient, when one man stands between absolute power and total control, that's when the shadows move. And on a humid June evening in Bangkok, those shadows came for Tanong Poearen. This is the story of a man who dared to speak when silence was commanded, who fought when surrender was demanded, and who disappeared when his existence became too dangerous to tolerate. The generals thought they could silence him. They were wrong, because the dead can scream louder than the living ever could. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Bangkok, 1991. A city of temples and traffic, prayer and pollution, where the ancient and modern collide in a cacophony of motorcycle engines and temple bells. But threading through the spiritual heart of Thailand was a poison, spreading silently through the veins of democracy itself. The military had returned, dressed in pressed uniforms and draped in legitimacy they hadn't earned, hadn't won, hadn't deserved. February 23rd arrived like a blade in the darkness. While most of Bangkok slept, armored vehicles rolled through streets still wet from evening rain, their treads grinding against asphalt like teeth against bone. General Sunthorn Kongsampong and his brother-in-arms, General Suchinda Kraprayun, had orchestrated what they called a necessary intervention. The democratically elected Prime Minister Chatichai Kunhaven was arrested at an airbase in Chiang Mai, dragged from his plans like prey from a den. Democracy didn't die with a whimper that morning. It died with the roar of tank engines and the click of rifle safeties being released. They named themselves the National Peacekeeping Council, the NPKC, as if peace could be kept at gunpoint, as if order justified oppression. 3 days after seizing power, they gathered in the Thai Army Auditorium, these men in their decorated uniforms and self-satisfied grins. The king had endorsed their coup. They raised champagne glasses to each other in a televised ceremony, bubbles rising in crystal like the souls of democratic principles ascending to wherever dead ideals go. They toasted their victory, they celebrated their control, and somewhere in that glittering moment of self-congratulation, they sealed their own infamy. But power, real power, isn't taken in a single violent gesture. It's consolidated piece by piece, right by right, voice by voice. The NPKC knew this. They moved swiftly, surgically. Order number 54 dropped like a guillotine blade. All labor unions in state-owned enterprises were dissolved immediately. Over 270,000 workers woke up one morning to find their collective voice had been legislatively amputated. No more bargaining, no more demands, no more organized resistance, just compliance or else. Most labor leaders understood the implicit threat. Some actually supported the coup, their spines dissolved by fear or ambition or both. They brought bouquets of flowers to the generals, perfumed offerings to brutal men, congratulating the very forces that had just stripped their workers of protection. But there was one man who didn't bring flowers. One man who looked at the generals and their champagne and their tanks and refused to genuflect. His name was Tanong Poearen, 55 years old, stocky build, glasses that reflected light like interrogation room fixtures. Tanong carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had fought too many battles to be impressed by uniforms. As president of the Labor Congress of Thailand, he had spent years in the trenches of workers' rights, negotiating with governments, building coalitions, creating the framework for Thailand's comprehensive national social security system. He was also a Thai senator and vice president of the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions for the Asia-Pacific region. This wasn't some amateur activist. This was a man who understood power, who knew how to wield influence, who had connections that stretched beyond Thailand's borders. And that made him dangerous. When the NPKC summoned all labor leaders for a meeting after the coup, Tan Ong attended. He sat among his peers, the ones who would soon grovel, and he listened to the new reality being dictated to them. Workers' rights were being limited. Freedom of assembly was being curtailed. The unions that had taken decades to build were being dismantled with the stroke of a military pen. And while others nodded and calculated their survival, Tan Ong stood up and denounced it all. He spoke of workers' rights as fundamental, not negotiable. He framed the coup not as salvation but as an attack on democratic principles. His words cut through the room like a razor through silk, elegant and devastating. The generals noted his defiance. They always do. In June 1991, Tan Ong received an invitation that should have been an honor. Represent Thailand at the International Labour Organization's annual conference in Geneva, Switzerland. He planned to go. He planned to stand before the international community and expose what the NPKC was doing to Thailand's workers. He would detail Order Number 54. He would name names. He would turn Thailand's internal oppression into a global embarrassment. The Ministry of Interior sent him a letter. Not a request, a command. You are forbidden to attend. Tan Ong read that letter in his office, probably while smoking one of his cigarettes, probably while considering the weight of what defiance would cost. And he decided to go anyway, because some men, when pushed into corners, come out swinging. But he wasn't naive. He knew what he was dealing with. He knew that authoritarian regimes don't debate their critics. They eliminate them. During those final weeks, Tan Ong noticed things. Shadows that followed him from his office to his home. Cars that appeared in his rearview mirror too consistently to be coincidence. Phone calls that crackled with breathing but no voice. Anonymous death threats, whispered and written, delivered through channels designed to terrify without attribution. His life had become a surveillance state unto itself, every movement monitored, every conversation potentially his last. He told his wife, Rakanibun, things he shouldn't have had to say. Things no husband should have to articulate to the woman he loves. If I don't contact you for 3 days, that means I've been arrested. He spoke it like a diagnosis, clinical and certain. If it's more than 7 days, that means I'm already dead. She must have wanted to argue, to insist this was paranoia, to promise him safety that neither of them believed in. But she didn't, because they both knew. In Thailand, in 1991, under military rule, people disappeared. They disappeared, and the questions about them disappeared too, absorbed into the machinery of state-sanctioned amnesia. Tan Ong had one other major problem that made his situation exponentially more precarious. He was an insulin-dependent diabetic. His body was a ticking clock that required precise medical intervention to keep functioning. Without his insulin, without his medication, death wouldn't require violence. It would come slowly, agonizingly, as his body consumed itself from the inside out. His medical condition wasn't just a vulnerability. It was a weapon that could be used against him, and the people watching him knew it. June 19th loomed on the calendar like an execution date. The ILO conference was days away. Tan Ong prepared his remarks, organized his evidence, steeled himself for the international stage. He would speak truth to power, consequences be damned. He had spent his entire life fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He wasn't about to stop because some generals in Bangkok got nervous about bad publicity. But he never made it to Geneva. He never made it anywhere again. June 19th, 1991. Bangkok humid and heavy. The kind of weather that makes your shirt cling to your spine and your thoughts move sluggish through your skull. Tan Ong woke that morning in his home, kissed his wife, perhaps looked at his children with the peculiar intensity of a man who suspects he's seeing them for the last time. Did he know? On some animal level, did his instincts scream warnings his rational mind refused to hear? We'll never know what thoughts circulated through his consciousness that morning, what prayers he might have whispered, what regrets flickered through his awareness. What we do know is that he was being watched. The surveillance had intensified, tightened like a noose around his daily routine. Everywhere Tanong went, eyes followed. Black sedans with tinted windows. Men in casual clothes who moved with military precision. The state had deployed its resources to track one man's movements with the kind of attention usually reserved for foreign spies or domestic terrorists. Tanong Parn's crime was simpler and more damning. He insisted on telling the truth. His office was located in the Rat Barana district of Bangkok, a working-class area where industry and residential neighborhoods collided in the organized chaos typical of Thai urban planning. The Labor Congress of Thailand headquarters wasn't impressive, functional architecture, modest signage, the physical manifestation of workers' movements that operate on passion rather than capital. But from that unassuming building, Tanong had coordinated campaigns that had improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of Thai workers. It was his stronghold, his war room, his sanctuary, until it became the last place anyone saw him alive. Eyewitness accounts from that day are fragmentary, incomplete, sanitized by fear and the passage of decades. What can be pieced together reads like the opening chapter of a horror novel where the monster hasn't fully revealed itself yet, but its presence saturates every scene. Tanong arrived at his office that morning, conducting what appeared to be routine business. Meetings were held. Phone calls were made. He reviewed documents related to the upcoming ILO conference, refining arguments, sharpening accusations. He was a man at work, doing what he had always done. But something was different. The tension that had been building for months had reached critical mass. The air itself felt charged, electric with impending violence. People who worked with Tanong that day would later report, quietly, anonymously, terrified of retribution, that he seemed preoccupied. Not afraid, not exactly, but aware, hypervigilant, like a deer that's caught the scent of wolves circling just beyond the treeline. The hours ticked forward. Afternoon bled into evening. Bangkok's traffic began its daily ritual of honking horns and exhaust fumes, millions of people heading home to families and dinners and the ordinary comfort of routine existence. And somewhere in that transition from day to night, in that liminal space between professional obligation and personal life, Tanong Pararn left his office for the last time. He walked to his car, keys in hand, perhaps planning what he'd eat for dinner, perhaps thinking about Geneva and the speech he'd deliver, perhaps considering nothing more profound than the heat and his need for his evening insulin injection. He got into his vehicle. He started the engine. And then something happened. Something that transformed an ordinary evening departure into one of Thailand's most enduring mysteries. Did they approach him immediately? Did they follow him, waiting for the right moment, the right location, the right absence of witnesses? Did he resist? Did he try to drive away, pressing the accelerator as hands reached through the window? Did he know, in those final conscious moments, that this was it? That the 7-day deadline he'd warned his wife about was about to begin its countdown? The car was found later that night, parked near his office, empty. Not crashed, not ransacked, just empty. As if Tanong had simply stepped out, intending to return in a moment, then vanished into the humid Bangkok air like smoke dissipating in wind. The keys were gone. His briefcase, which contained documents related to the ILO conference, documents that detailed the NPKC's attacks on workers' rights, documents that would have embarrassed Thailand's military government on an international stage, gone. His medication, the insulin that kept him alive, that regulated the chemistry keeping him functional, gone. Everything that made Tanong Pararn a functional human being had been extracted from that vehicle, leaving only the shell behind, mute and abandoned. His wife, Rakanibun, felt the dread settle into her stomach when he didn't come home. Hour 1, he's stuck in traffic. Hour 2, maybe he stopped somewhere. Hour 3, the beginnings of real fear. When midnight passed with no word, with no phone call, with no explanation, she knew. He told her exactly how long to wait before accepting the truth. 3 days. But in her heart, she knew immediately. You don't live with a man for decades. Don't share a bed and a life and children with someone. without developing an instinct for their absence. And this absence felt permanent. She began making calls to friends, to colleagues, to anyone who might have seen him, might know something, might offer reassurance that would be a lie but at least postpone the inevitable acknowledgement of horror. Nobody had seen him. Nobody knew anything. Or if they did, they weren't talking. Fear does that. It makes witnesses forget what they saw, makes potential informants suddenly develop amnesia, makes everyone retreat into protective silence because speaking up might make you the next one to disappear. Rakhaniban waited the 3 days he'd specified. 72 hours of purgatory, of hope corroding into despair, of checking windows for his return while knowing he wouldn't appear. On day 4, she went to the police. She walked into a station and reported that her husband, a prominent labor leader, a Thai senator, a man of international standing, had vanished. And the police, these servants of a state now controlled by the military who had reasons to want Tanong silenced, listened politely, took notes, and did absolutely nothing. They couldn't find evidence of foul play, they said. Without a body, they explained, they couldn't confirm any criminal activity. Perhaps he'd left voluntarily. Perhaps there were personal issues, financial troubles, romantic entanglements, debts to dangerous people. The insinuations were cruel and calculated, designed to tarnish Tanong's reputation while absolving the authorities of any obligation to search seriously. Some officials suggested he might have run away from his wife. Others whispered about gambling debts or organized crime. The character assassination began before his body was cold, assuming there was a body at all. But Rakhaniban knew her husband, and she knew his medical condition. Tanong was insulin dependent. Without his medication, he would go into diabetic ketoacidosis. His blood would become acidic. His organs would begin shutting down. He would experience confusion, nausea, abdominal pain. His breathing would become rapid and shallow. And eventually, within days, he would slip into a coma and die. If Tanong Parn was still alive somewhere, being held by whoever had taken him, his captors would need to provide insulin regularly to keep him breathing. The moment they stopped, his death would become inevitable, slow, and agonizing. 7 days passed, the deadline Tanong himself had set for his own execution. Rakhaniban moved through grief that had no body to bury, no closure to grasp. She sent letters to every government organization she could think of, pleading for information, demanding investigation, begging for anything that might explain where her husband had gone. She received only silence, bureaucratic silence, official silence, the silence of a state that had decided certain questions were better left unasked. And somewhere in Bangkok, whether in a shallow grave or dissolved in acid or dumped in the Chao Phraya River that cuts through the city like a vein through flesh, Tanong Parn's body began its transformation from human being to ghost, from political problem to unsolved mystery, from voice of the voiceless to one more name on the endless list of the disappeared. Enforced disappearance is a special kind of torture, refined over decades by authoritarian regimes around the world into something approaching an art form. It's not just murder. Murder can be investigated, prosecuted, avenged. A body provides evidence, creates crime scenes, leaves forensic breadcrumbs for determined investigators to follow. But disappearance? Disappearance is the perfect crime. No body means no murder charge. No witnesses mean no testimony. No evidence means no prosecution. The victim simply ceases to exist in any legal sense, erased from reality as thoroughly as if they'd never been born. Thailand has become disturbingly proficient at this erasure. The United Nations Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances reported 86 unresolved cases in Thailand as of their last comprehensive review. 86 human beings who walked out their doors one day and never came back. 86 families left with questions that burrow into your psyche and hollow you out from the inside. 86 stories of last phone calls and empty chairs at dinner tables and birthdays celebrated for people who might be dead or might be suffering somewhere beyond reach, beyond help, beyond hope. But that number, 86, represents only the cases that made it onto official records, cases where families had the courage and resources to report the disappearance, where the vanished person was prominent enough that their absence couldn't be completely ignored. The real number is certainly higher. How much higher is a question that keeps human rights researchers awake at night, doing mathematics with incomplete data, trying to count shadows and quantify absence. Tanong Piarn's disappearance fit a pattern that would become grimly familiar to anyone studying Thailand's relationship with dissent. The pattern goes like this. First, the target becomes vocal in their criticism of military or state power. They cross an invisible line from annoying to dangerous, from irritant to threat. Second, surveillance begins. Subtle at first, then increasingly overt, the surveillance serves dual purposes: gather intelligence and send a warning. Third, death threats arrive. Anonymous phone calls, letters with no return address, messages delivered through intermediaries. The threats are designed to induce self-censorship, to make the target silence themselves through fear, saving the state the trouble of more direct intervention. Fourth, if the target doesn't comply, doesn't retreat, doesn't shut up, they're disappeared. It's efficient, it's deniable, and it sends a message that resonates through every activist, every critic, every person who might be considering speaking truth to power. The message is simple: this could be you. This will be you if you continue. Your family will search for you. Your friends will mourn you. And the state will shrug and suggest you probably ran away from your wife. 2 committees were established to investigate Tanong's disappearance. The first was convened in the Ministry of Interior in 1992, a year after he vanished. The second was assembled in Parliament. Both committees conducted their investigations behind closed doors, interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence, constructing a narrative of what happened that June evening. And both committees produced reports that were never made public. Reports that sit in government archives somewhere, gathering dust, containing information that could provide closure to Tanong's family or implicate powerful people in his disappearance. We don't know which. We just know that those reports remain classified, state secrets protected by the same government that claims to want answers about the disappeared. Amnesty International has repeatedly called for these reports to be released. The International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, the organization where Tanong served as vice president for the Asia-Pacific region, has demanded transparency. Human rights organizations around the world have pressured Thailand to ratify the UN Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. Thailand has refused, not declined politely, actively refused, rejecting international standards that might create accountability for disappearances or provide legal framework to investigate them as distinct crimes. Why? What's in those reports that's worth protecting 3 decades after the fact? What names appear in the findings that Thailand's establishment finds more important to shield than providing truth to a widow and her children? The refusal to release information isn't just bureaucratic inertia. It's active suppression. Someone, somewhere in Thailand's power structure, has decided that whatever those investigations revealed is too dangerous to share, too incriminating to expose, too threatening to the myth of state legitimacy to allow into public consciousness. And Tanong's case isn't unique. It's emblematic. Consider Somchai Nyapajit, a human rights lawyer who disappeared in March 2004. Somchai was representing 5 Muslim men accused of gun robbery who claimed they'd been tortured by police during custody. For doing his job as a defense attorney, for insisting that his clients receive fair treatment under law, Somchai received death threats. Multiple eyewitnesses saw him being forced into a car on a Bangkok street in broad daylight. 5 police officers were arrested. 1 was convicted of robbery and coercion and sentenced to 3 years in prison. 3 years. For participating in the kidnapping and presumed murder of a human rights lawyer. The other 4 were acquitted. Somchai's body has never been found. His case remains technically unsolved. Another unsolved disappearance in a country that seems to have specialized in creating them. Or consider Billy Rakshoncharin, a Karen environmental activist who was arrested by national park officers in April 2014 while carrying documents related to a lawsuit against forced evictions of indigenous villages. He was released the same day, according to the park superintendent. Except Billy was never seen again. His body has never been found. His wife spent years fighting for investigation, for answers, for accountability. Eventually, exhausted and terrified and worn down by a system designed to frustrate rather than facilitate justice, she requested that a court declare him legally dead. Not because she'd found closure, because she needed his life insurance to feed their 5 children and support his elderly mother. Because survival sometimes requires accepting that the dead aren't coming back, even when you don't know where they are or how they died or who killed them. Thailand's pattern of enforced disappearances targets specific demographics. Land rights activists who challenge corporate interests in resource-rich areas. Environmental defenders who protest deforestation or mining operations. Labor leaders who organize workers against exploitation. Political dissidents who criticize military rule. Lawyers who defend people accused of crimes against the state. Journalists who investigate corruption. These aren't random victims. These are intentional targets, people whose work threatens established power structures, whose voices carry enough weight to potentially shift public opinion or policy. And the state has learned that you don't need to kill all your critics. You just need to kill enough of them, visibly enough, with enough impunity, that the survivors get the message. You create an atmosphere of terror through strategic violence. You make examples, and suddenly, self-censorship becomes epidemic. Journalists write softer stories. Activists moderate their demands. Lawyers think twice before taking controversial cases. The disappeared serve their purpose especially when they're never found. Their absence is the warning, their fate the unspoken threat. Human rights organizations attempting to document cases of enforced disappearance in Thailand face obstacles that would be funny if they weren't so sinister. Witnesses develop sudden amnesia. Documents mysteriously go missing from official records. Investigators receive anonymous warnings to drop their inquiries. Government officials provide conflicting information or stonewall entirely. Relatives of the disappeared are harassed, followed, threatened. The machinery protecting the perpetrators of these crimes is well-oiled and comprehensive, a system designed to ensure that questions die before answers can emerge. And it works. Decades pass. The disappeared remain disappeared. Families age without resolution. Children grow up not knowing what happened to their parents. And the state continues insisting that it takes human rights seriously, while refusing to ratify international conventions or pass domestic legislation that would make enforced disappearance a crime with meaningful penalties. The cognitive dissonance is staggering but also revealing. Thailand wants the appearance of respecting human rights without the accountability those rights would require. In 2011, the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances requested permission to visit Thailand to investigate the scale and nature of disappearances. The request was followed up with reminders in consecutive years. The Thai government has never formally responded. Not declined the visit, simply never responded, as if ignoring the request long enough will make it disappear, which is grimly appropriate given the subject matter. Tanong Parn vanished in 1991. Over 3 decades have passed. His wife has spent those decades in limbo, never knowing if her husband is dead or alive, never receiving confirmation or closure, never getting answers to questions that have defined the second half of her life. She sent letters to every government organization. She received only silence. That silence speaks volumes about Thailand's relationship with truth, with justice, with the fundamental concept that people deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. And the generals who staged the coup? Suchinda Kraprayun became prime minister in 1992. His government massacred pro-democracy protesters in an event known as Black May. He resigned after the king intervened to stop the bloodshed. But he was never prosecuted, never held accountable, never even seriously investigated for potential involvement in Tanong's disappearance or the deaths during Black May. He lived out his years in comfortable retirement, his military pension intact, his reputation among certain circles unblemished. He died with his secrets, taking to the grave whatever knowledge he might have had about a labor leader who vanished just months into the military regime he helped establish. That's the other function of enforced disappearance. It protects the perpetrators. Without bodies, without evidence, without the possibility of prosecution, The people who order these disappearances face no consequences. They retire. They attend ceremonies. They're honored for their service. And the ghosts of their victims haunt a nation that has decided forgetting is easier than remembering, that moving forward is more important than looking back, that national unity requires amnesia about the violence that created and maintains that unity. Tanong Piarn fought for workers who couldn't fight for themselves. He stood up when others knelt. He spoke when silence was demanded. And for that, he was erased. Not just killed, erased, removed from existence with the kind of thoroughness that totalitarian states aspire to but rarely achieve. His story should have ended there. Another footnote in Thailand's long history of political violence. But it didn't, because some stories refuse to die, even when the people who live them are murdered. Some truths are too large to be buried, even in unmarked graves. 3 weeks after Tanong vanished, a fisherman working the Chao Phraya River snagged something on his net. Heavy, wrapped in plastic sheeting that had started to deteriorate in the murky water. He cut it loose quickly, pushed his boat away from that section of river, and never reported what he'd found. Because in Bangkok, in the summer of 1991, there were things you saw and things you pretended you didn't see. Bodies in rivers fell into the second category, especially when those bodies might have connections to powerful people who made other bodies disappear. We don't know if that was Tanong. We'll never know. The fisherman is long dead now, taking whatever he saw to his own grave, adding another layer of silence to a case built entirely from silence. But the story illustrates something crucial about enforced disappearance. It doesn't just erase the victim. It erases everyone's willingness to speak about the victim. Fear becomes contagious. Witnesses develop selective blindness. Memory becomes negotiable, and the truth drowns in the same waters that might have swallowed Tanong's body. Rakanibun waited past the 7-day deadline her husband had given her. She waited through weeks that turned into months that calcified into years. She filed missing person reports that went nowhere. She contacted every government agency that might have information, receiving either silence or suggestions that perhaps Tanong had gambling debts. Perhaps he'd run away with another woman. Perhaps he'd gotten involved in criminal activity. The character assassination was methodical and cruel, designed to discourage her from pushing harder, from asking louder questions, from demanding accountability. But she knew her husband's medical condition. Insulin-dependent diabetics don't just disappear and survive for extended periods without their medication. The timeline was brutally simple. Without insulin, Tanong would have gone into diabetic ketoacidosis within days. His organs would have started shutting down. He would have slipped into a coma, and then he would have died, slowly, agonizingly, his body consuming itself from the inside out. If he was taken alive on June 19th, he was almost certainly dead within a week. Maybe faster if his captors decided to accelerate the process. Maybe slower if they provided just enough medical care to keep him conscious during interrogation before withdrawing it as a method of execution. The thought of those final hours haunts everyone who knows his story. A man who spent his life fighting for workers' dignity, who stood up to dictators, who refused to be intimidated even when death threats multiplied and surveillance became oppressive, reduced in his final moments to a diabetic crisis induced deliberately by withholding medication. It's torture without leaving marks. It's murder with plausible deniability. And it's exactly the kind of sophisticated cruelty that state security apparatus excel at when they want someone dead but need the death to look like natural causes or unfortunate circumstances. 2 government committees investigated Tanong's disappearance. The first convened in the Ministry of Interior in 1992. The second assembled in Parliament. Both conducted interviews, reviewed evidence, and produced comprehensive reports. Those reports have never been released to the public. Not redacted versions. Not summaries. Nothing. They remain classified, locked in government archives, protected by official secrets laws and bureaucratic stonewalling. For over 3 decades, Thailand has refused to make public what its own investigators discovered about Tanong Piarn's disappearance. Why? What's in those reports that requires this level of protection 34 years later? The obvious answer is names. The reports presumably identify who ordered the surveillance on Tanong, who authorized his detention, who participated in his disappearance, and who knew about it afterward. They might detail the specific unit responsible, the chain of command involved, the location where he was held, the method used to kill him, the disposal site for his body. Everything that would transform this from an unsolved mystery into a prosecutable crime sits in those files, gathering dust, protected by a government that values institutional stability over individual justice. International pressure has been constant but ineffective. Amnesty International has repeatedly called for the report's release. The UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances has requested access. The International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, where Tanong served as vice president for the Asia-Pacific region, has demanded transparency. Thailand responds with platitudes about ongoing investigations, about respecting confidentiality, about national security concerns. The excuses change, but the result remains constant. Silence. And Tanong's case isn't isolated. Thailand has become a case study in how authoritarian regimes use enforced disappearance as a tool of political control. The UN Working Group documented 86 unresolved cases as of their last comprehensive review. 86 people who walked out their doors and never came back. 86 families trapped in the purgatory of not knowing, unable to grieve properly because there's no body, unable to move forward because there's no closure, unable to seek justice because there's no evidence. But that number, 86, represents only the cases that made it onto official records. The real total is certainly higher. How much higher is a question that haunts human rights researchers who try to count shadows and quantify absence. For every high-profile disappearance like Tanong's, how many workers, farmers, activists, and critics vanished without anyone noticing? How many families were too afraid to report the disappearance? How many cases were dismissed by police as runaways or suicides before investigation even began? Consider Somchai Nyapajit, a human rights lawyer who disappeared in March 2004. Multiple witnesses saw him being forced into a car in broad daylight on a Bangkok street. 5 police officers were arrested. 1 was convicted of robbery and coercion, not kidnapping, not murder, but robbery and coercion, and sentenced to 3 years. 3 years for participating in the disappearance of a prominent human rights lawyer. The other 4 were acquitted. Somchai's body has never been found. His widow spent years fighting for investigation, for answers, for accountability. She got none. His case file sits alongside Tanong's in the archives of the disappeared. Or Billy Rakshongcharin, a Karen environmental activist arrested by national park officers in April 2014 while carrying documents related to a lawsuit against forced evictions. He was released the same day, according to official records. Except Billy never went home. His wife searched. His community organized. Human rights groups investigated. Years passed. Eventually, exhausted and desperate, his wife requested that a court declare him legally dead so she could access his life insurance to support their 5 children and his elderly mother. Not because she'd found closure, because survival required accepting that the missing weren't coming back. The pattern is consistent and chilling. Activists who challenge powerful interests, whether military, corporate, or political, receive warnings. Death threats arrive through anonymous channels. Surveillance intensifies. If they don't back down, if they continue pushing, they disappear. Sometimes their bodies surface later, decomposed beyond easy identification, allowing authorities to claim they died from accidents or natural causes. Sometimes they're never found at all, erased so completely that even confirmation of death becomes impossible. And the perpetrators? They retire comfortably. They attend official ceremonies. They're honored for their service. General Suchinda Kroprayon, who led the coup that brought the NPKC to power, became prime minister in 1992. His government massacred pro-democracy protesters during Black May. He resigned after the king intervened but was never prosecuted, never investigated, never held accountable for potential involvement in Tanong's disappearance or the deaths of protesters. He lived out his years in comfortable retirement and died peacefully, his secrets intact. That's the genius of enforced disappearance from the perpetrator's perspective. No body means no murder charge. No witnesses mean no testimony. No evidence means no prosecution. The crime is perfect because it can't be proven. The victim simply ceases to exist in any legal sense, and everyone involved walks free. Except the ghosts don't stay buried. Tanong's face appears on banners during labor protests. His name surfaces in speeches demanding accountability for the disappeared. His story circulates through Thailand's activist networks as a warning and an inspiration. A warning about what happens when you challenge power, an inspiration about why that challenge matters anyway. The generals who made him disappear thought they were eliminating a problem. Instead, they created a symbol that haunts every subsequent attempt to suppress dissent. On May Day, decades after his disappearance, workers marched through Bangkok carrying signs with his image. Most weren't alive when he vanished. They never met him, never heard him speak, never benefited directly from the policies he negotiated. But they know his name. They understand what he represents. And they've decided that remembering him is an act of resistance, that invoking his memory is a promise. We will not be silenced. Rakanibun is elderly now. She spent more than 3 decades without her husband, without answers, without closure. She's sent countless letters to government agencies. She's participated in memorial gatherings every anniversary of his disappearance. She's connected with families of other disappeared persons, building networks of grief that transform into networks of resistance. And she's never stopped asking the same questions. What happened to my husband? Who took him? Where is his body? Will anyone ever be held accountable? The Thai government has never provided satisfactory answers to any of those questions. And the longer the silence persists, the more damning it becomes. Because at this point, 34 years later, the people directly responsible for Tanong's disappearance are likely dead or very old. The political context has changed. The NPKC is history. Thailand has cycled through multiple governments, coups, constitutions. And yet the reports remain classified. The truth stays buried. The families of the disappeared are denied even the meager comfort of knowing what happened. That choice, to maintain secrecy even after the immediate perpetrators are beyond prosecution, reveals something profound about how Thailand's establishment views accountability. It's not about protecting specific individuals anymore. It's about protecting the institution itself, the entire apparatus of state power that enabled and executed these disappearances. Releasing the truth would require acknowledging that Thailand's security forces murdered citizens for political reasons. It would create precedent for investigating other disappearances. It would open doors that powerful people want to keep closed. So the silence continues. And with it, the implicit message that disappearing critics is an acceptable tool of governance, that the state can murder its citizens without consequence, that power trumps justice every single time. That message resonates through Thailand's activist communities, through its labor movements, through every person who considers speaking out about injustice. The disappeared serve their purpose even in death. Their warnings, examples, proof that defiance carries costs that the state can impose without accountability. But here's what the generals who disappeared Tanong couldn't anticipate. Martyrs multiply. Every person who learns his story and decides to continue his work. Every activist who wears his face on a t-shirt during protests. Every family member of the disappeared who refuses to stop asking questions. Every human rights researcher who documents these cases. Every international organization that pressures Thailand to ratify conventions on enforced disappearance. They're all Tanong now, carrying forward the fight he couldn't finish, amplifying the voice that was meant to be silenced. His body was never found. His grave, if one exists, remains unmarked and unknown. His family never received the closure of a funeral, never performed the Buddhist rites that might give his spirit peace. He exists in that terrible liminal space of the disappeared, not confirmed dead, not presumed alive, suspended in bureaucratic uncertainty that serves the killers while torturing the survivors. But his legacy persists in ways that mock the intentions of those who made him vanish. Every labor law in Thailand carries his fingerprints. Every worker who joins a union walks in his footsteps. Every person who stands up to authority despite threats honors his memory. The generals wanted him erased. Instead, they made him immortal. Not the immortality he would have chosen. Tanong wanted to live. He wanted to attend that ILO conference in Geneva, deliver his speech, expose the NPKC's violations, then fly home to his wife and children. He wanted to keep fighting, keep organizing, keep building the labor movement that had consumed his adult life. Martyrdom wasn't his goal. It was the price his enemies extracted for his refusal to comply. And it was a brutal price. Imagine those final hours wherever they occurred. Tanong, feeling his body shutting down from lack of insulin, knowing exactly what was happening to him, unable to do anything about it. The confusion as diabetic ketoacidosis sets in. The nausea, the rapid breathing as his body tries to expel ketones through his lungs. The organ failure starting to cascade through his system. And through all of it, the knowledge that this was deliberate, that someone was withholding the medication that would save him, that his death was being orchestrated by people who considered him dangerous enough to kill but not dangerous enough to acknowledge killing. That's the horror at the center of Tanong Parn's story. Not just that he died, but how he died. Not just that he was disappeared, but that he was likely conscious during his execution by medical neglect. Not just that his body was disposed of, but that his killers felt confident enough in their impunity to never worry about discovery, prosecution, or accountability. They were right to be confident. 34 years later, no one has been charged. No one has been prosecuted. No one has even been officially accused. The investigation reports remain classified. The truth stays buried with Tanong's body, wherever that body lies. And Thailand continues its pattern of enforced disappearances, secure in the knowledge that the machinery protecting perpetrators functions smoothly, efficiently, and without meaningful resistance from institutions that exist theoretically to deliver justice. But some stories refuse to end, even when the people who live them are murdered. Some voices echo across decades, growing louder rather than fading. Some defeats contain victories invisible to those who inflict them. Tanong Parn was disappeared on a humid June evening in Bangkok. He never made it to Geneva. He never delivered his speech. He never came home to his wife and children. But the testimony he would have given has been delivered anyway, amplified by his martyrdom, spoken by thousands of voices instead of one. The labor movement he built continued without him, strengthened in some ways by the clarity of his sacrifice. The fight for workers' rights in Thailand carries his memory forward, invoking his name as proof that the cause is worth dying for. And every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, people gather. They light candles. They hold photographs. They demand answers that never come. They refuse to let him be forgotten. Because remembering the disappeared is the only justice available when the state denies actual justice. Because speaking their names keeps them present in a way that their killers never intended. Because some debts can never be paid, some crimes can never be forgiven, and some voices can never be truly silenced, no matter how deep you bury them. Tanong Parn fought for workers who couldn't fight for themselves. He stood when others knelt. He spoke when silence was commanded. And when the shadows came for him, when the machinery of state violence deployed to erase his existence, he faced his fate knowing the cost and paying it anyway. That's not naivety. That's courage chosen consciously, sacrifice accepted voluntarily. The generals who disappeared him are dead now, most of them. They lived comfortable lives and died peacefully. They won by certain measures. They kept their power, escaped accountability, took their secrets to marked graves with respectful obituaries. But nobody remembers them with love. Nobody invokes their names as inspiration. Nobody wears their faces on t-shirts during protests. They're footnotes in academic studies of authoritarianism, examples of what happens when power operates without accountability. While Tanong Parn disappeared, murdered, denied even a grave, lives on in the collective consciousness of everyone who believes that speaking truth matters, that principles are worth defending, that one voice raised in defiance can echo longer than all the general's guns. His story circulates through Thailand's activist networks like a virus of consciousness, infecting each new generation with knowledge of what their government is capable of and why resistance matters anyway. The Thai state still hasn't ratified the UN Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. Still hasn't released those investigation reports. Still hasn't acknowledged what everyone already knows. That Tanong was disappeared by state actors. That his disappearance was politically motivated. That everyone involved has been protected by a system designed to shelter perpetrators rather than serve victims. But despite this official silence, despite decades of denial and obfuscation, Tanong Parn's voice continues speaking. It speaks through every person who decides truth matters more than safety. It speaks through his widow's persistence, through the annual memorials, through the protesters who wear his face while marching through Bangkok demanding accountability. It speaks through the existence of this story itself, told and retold, circulated and remembered, refusing to let the disappeared be forgotten. Some men vanish into legend. Tanong Parn was erased by design, but erasure failed, because the dead can scream louder than the living ever could. And his scream for justice, for accountability, for truth, for the simple human right to exist without fear of state-sanctioned murder, that scream echoes still. Not the victory he wanted, but the victory he earned. And the nightmare his killers created, eternal judgment by memory, eternal testimony from a voice they tried to kill and instead made immortal. Listen carefully. In the silence between Bangkok's traffic and temple bells. In the spaces where questions go unanswered. In the darkness that swallowed him whole but couldn't digest his legacy. Tanong Parn is speaking still. And he'll keep speaking until Thailand finally tells the truth, or until the last person capable of remembering is gone. And probably even after that. Because some voices refuse to die, even from unmarked graves, even across decades of official silence, even when everything about their existence has been systematically erased except the one thing that matters most, the story of what they stood for and what was done to them for standing. That story survives. That story spreads. That story becomes the monument the disappeared never received, the justice they were denied, the revenge they never sought but achieved anyway. Tanong Parn disappeared into Bangkok's humid darkness on June 19, 1991. His body was never found. His killers were never punished. His family never received closure. But his voice echoes louder now than it ever did in life, carried forward by everyone who hears his story and decides that silence is surrender and memory is resistance, and telling the truth about the disappeared is the only way to ensure they weren't disappeared in vain. The generals are gone. The dictatorship ended. The coup failed its ultimate purpose. But Tanong endures, in protest chants and memorial gatherings, in demands for justice, in the consciousness of everyone who refuses to forget, in the voice that speaks still decades after silence was imposed, proving that you can kill the messenger but never the message, that you can disappear the man but never the movement, that you can silence the voice but never the echo. That echo is the price of his murder. And Thailand will keep paying it year after year, generation after generation, until someone finally tells the truth or everyone who knows it is dead. And even then, the echo will remain, because that's how martyrs work. They haunt, they persist, they speak from the grave in ways the living never could. And Tanong Parn is speaking still, on their chest while marching through Bangkok, demanding that Thailand finally reckon with its past. Some voices can't be silenced, no matter how deep you bury them, no matter how thoroughly you erase the evidence, no matter how many years pass without resolution. Some voices transcend the flesh that housed them, becoming something larger and more permanent than any single human life. Tanong Parn's voice is one of them. The generals tried to silence it. They failed. And that failure, that inability to erase what he represented even by erasing him, stands as testament to something the powerful never want to admit. That ideas are bulletproof, that martyrs multiply resistance rather than end it, that trying to kill the truth only makes it immortal. He disappeared into Bangkok's humid darkness on a June evening in 1991. But he never really left. He's still there, in every labor rights negotiation, every protest against authoritarianism, every family searching for answers about their disappeared loved ones, every person who decides that silence is surrender, and speaking up is the only way to stay human. The generals wanted him gone. Instead, they made him eternal. That's not justice. His family still deserves justice, still needs answers, still seeks closure that may never come. But it's something. It's proof that power has limits, that violence isn't omnipotent, that some defeats contain victories invisible to those who inflict them. Tanong Piarn's final gift to Thailand wasn't the labor laws he negotiated or the unions he built or the conference speech he never got to deliver. It was this: the demonstration that courage exists, that it's contagious, that one person's refusal to kneel can inspire thousands to stand, that death isn't the worst thing that can happen to someone. Being forgotten is worse, and he will never be forgotten. His voice echoes still and will continue echoing until Thailand finally tells the truth about what happened to him, or until every person who knows that truth is dead, and probably even after that. Because some stories refuse to end, even when the people who live them are murdered. Some voices refuse to silence, even from unmarked graves. Some defeats are actually victories, if you measure them across decades instead of days. The disappeared never really disappear. They haunt, they persist, they speak from the grave in ways the living never could. And Tanong Piarn, labor leader, senator, husband, father, insulin-dependent diabetic who needed medication to survive and was denied it by people who wanted him dead, is speaking still. Not in the words he would have spoken, in something louder, in something that can never be stopped. In the echoes of resistance that ripple forward through time, carried by everyone who hears his story and decides that his sacrifice means something, that his courage demands continuation, that his voice requires amplification until justice is finally served or the last person capable of remembering him is gone. He fought for workers. He died for principles. He disappeared into darkness. And he came back as light, illuminating Thailand's patterns of state violence, exposing the machinery of disappearance, revealing the truth that authoritarians fear most: that you can kill the messenger, but the message survives; that you can disappear the man, but the movement continues; that you can silence the voice, but never the echo. That's how Tanong Piarn won. Not through survival, they killed him for that. Through memory, through legacy, through the stubborn persistence of truth that refuses burial. The generals are gone. The dictatorship ended. The coup failed its ultimate purpose. But Tanong endures, in protest chants and memorial gatherings and t-shirts and demands for justice. In the consciousness of everyone who knows his story and decides they won't let him be forgotten. In the voice that speaks still, decades after silence was imposed. Some men vanish into legend. Tanong Piarn was erased by design, but erasure failed, because the dead can scream louder than the living ever could. And his scream for justice, for accountability, for truth, for the simple human right to exist without fear of state-sanctioned murder, that scream continues, will always continue, echoing across the decades, impossible to silence, refusing to fade. That's not the victory he wanted, but it's the victory he earned. And it's the nightmare his killers created for themselves. Eternal judgment by history, eternal condemnation by memory, eternal testimony from a voice they tried to kill and instead made immortal. Listen carefully. On May Day in Bangkok, when the workers march and chant and demand their rights. In midnight moments when activists plan resistance. In courtrooms where families of the disappeared demand answers. In the silence that follows when government officials refuse to respond to questions about the missing. Beneath all of it, constant and clear, Tanong Piarn speaking still. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Disappeared Road. The Earl Van Denton Story. The empty building had only one door, and on the afternoon of June 23, 1977, no one stood watch over it. Inside, 3 men sat among the debris of a demolished brick factory near the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. Paul Ruiz, 29 years old, was serving life for armed robbery. Earl Van Denton, 27, was serving life for murder, a killing he'd committed 7 years earlier in a motel room, where he'd beaten a man named William Droke with a bottle, a telephone receiver, and finally a shovel until life left the body. The third man, 18-year-old Elmer Finnan, had his own reasons for wanting freedom. They were supposed to be having lunch. They were part of a 20-member work crew tasked with tearing down the factory, one of those prison labor details that gave men a glimpse of the world beyond walls and wire. But someone had made a mistake. Someone had placed these 3 men in an empty building with an unguarded door during their lunch break. And at some point during that June afternoon, the 3 realized what lay before them. Not conversation or sandwiches or the regulated minutes of a prisoner's day. Opportunity. They walked through the door. They simply walked through it. 2 guards would later be demoted and suspended for what happened next. But by then it wouldn't matter. By then, the unguarded door would have become a portal to something far worse than administrative failure. The city of McAlester absorbed them quickly. Finnan separated from the other 2 almost immediately, vanishing into whatever future awaited him. But Ruiz and Van Denton stayed together. They had something in common beyond their sentences, beyond their capacity for violence. They understood each other in the way that certain predators do, moving with an instinctive coordination that required no discussion. 2 men already serving life sentences for violent crimes, now loose in the world with nothing left to lose. For days later, on June 27th, a man named Gerald Leon Tiffy disappeared in Boswell, Oklahoma. He was there and then he wasn't. His pickup truck was found later, but Tiffy himself never was. The authorities suspected Ruiz and Van Denton, but suspicion without evidence is just another word for haunting. Tiffy joined the ranks of the missing, his fate absorbed into the vast uncertainty of unsolved cases. The 2 men moved southeast, toward Louisiana, driving vehicles that didn't belong to them through landscapes they had no right to traverse. On June 28th, near Colfax, Louisiana, they encountered Jimmy Cockrell's. The encounter ended with Cockrell's body lying near the roadside, life taken for reasons that existed only in the minds of his killers. Cockrell's was 38 years old. He had been riding a motorcycle. Now he was dead. That same day, or so investigators would later believe, 2 elderly fishermen, Ray Jones, 65, and Alton Wilson, 66, were killed near Franklinton, Louisiana. Their bodies were discovered in Gerald Tiffy's submerged pickup truck, in a flooded gravel pit where the water had turned the vehicle into a tomb. The men who had taken Tiffy's truck had apparently decided it had served its purpose, and the fishermen who saw them, or simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong moment, became collateral damage to that decision. In 6 days, Ruiz and Van Denton had likely killed 5 people. But they weren't finished. They turned north, toward Arkansas, carrying with them a momentum that seemed to accelerate with each passing mile. Violence had its own gravity now, pulling them forward, and the stolen car they drove was just another temporary vessel in a journey that appeared to have no destination beyond the next opportunity for harm. Near the town of Magazine in Logan County, Arkansas, the stolen car developed a flat tire. It was an ordinary mechanical failure, the kind that happens to anyone, anywhere, without warning. But for Ruiz and Van Denton, it became another moment of decision. They removed the tire from the car and began rolling it toward town to have it repaired. 2 escaped convicts, wanted for multiple murders across multiple states, rolling a tire down a rural Arkansas road in broad daylight as if they were nothing more than motorists inconvenienced by bad luck. Citizens of Magazine noticed them. Small-town people noticed strangers, especially strangers engaged in the unusual activity of rolling a tire down the road. Someone called Marvin Ritchie, the town marshal. Ritchie was 42 years old, a man who had taken on the responsibility of keeping Magazine safe, and when he received word of the stranded motorists, he responded the way small-town lawmen often did in 1977, with an assumption of service rather than suspicion. He got into his patrol car and drove out of town to offer assistance. It was approximately 9 a.m. on June 29, 1977, near Scott Creek Road. Ritchie radioed the Boonville Police Department to request a license check. The radio crackled with his voice, routine communication in what appeared to be a routine situation. Then silence. Ritchie never responded to subsequent radio calls. About 30 minutes later, when the silence had stretched too long, a search was organized to find him. But Marvin Ritchie was already gone, already transformed from a helper into a hostage, his patrol car now under the control of two men who had just been given another opportunity they couldn't resist. They had wanted the marshal's car. They had taken Marvin Ritchie along with it, and now they were driving through the very town he was supposed to protect, visible to anyone who happened to look. Witnesses would later report seeing Ritchie handcuffed in the back seat of his own patrol car as it moved through Magazine and Blue Mountain, driven by two men who looked nothing like the marshal everyone knew. The image was surreal and terrifying. A symbol of order inverted, authority made captive, the trusted vehicle of law enforcement commandeered by lawlessness itself. They drove toward Ashley Recreation Area on the shore of Blue Mountain Lake, where the forest grew thick and the roads grew quiet. It was the kind of place families went to fish or picnic, where the Corps of Engineers maintained the land for public use, where people came to forget about trouble rather than find it. But trouble was coming to Ashley Recreation Area that morning, riding in a stolen patrol car, and it would arrive before 1:30 p.m. in the form of two escaped convicts who had already demonstrated they considered human life an obstacle rather than a value. At the recreation area, they encountered a truck driven by two United States Army Corps of Engineers Rangers. David Small, 27 years old, and Opal James, 58 years old, were just doing their jobs, maintaining the public lands entrusted to their care. They saw the patrol car. They probably assumed it meant safety, the presence of law enforcement in a place where law enforcement was welcome but rarely necessary. They were ordered into the patrol car at gunpoint. Whatever they understood in that moment, and they must have understood something terrible was happening, they complied. Sometimes compliance is the only option available when violence announces itself. Ruiz and Van Denton drove all of them into a thickly wooded area, deep enough that the trees would swallow sound, far enough that discovery would require more than accident. What happened next was methodical. There was no rage, no passion, just the cold execution of a plan. Small and Ritchie were handcuffed together. The metal bit into their wrists as they were forced toward the trunk of the patrol car, the cramped darkness waiting to receive them. Opal James was made to lie on the ground behind the vehicle. Ruiz took Small's watch. One of the men took Ritchie's shirt. These weren't acts of necessity. These were assertions of power, small cruelties that preceded the larger one. Then came the shots. The trunk lid closed on darkness and blood. Marvin Ritchie had been struck in the head, the bullet ending his life almost instantly. David Small had been shot in the chest, the impact driving him into unconsciousness, the blackness swallowing him whole. For several minutes, he existed in that liminal space between life and death, between consciousness and void, trapped in a trunk with a dead man, his own blood spreading in the confined darkness. When he woke, he was alone with silence and a corpse and the knowledge that he had somehow survived what was designed to kill him. He was alive. Marvin Ritchie was not. And Opal James, 58-year-old Opal James, who had been forced to lie on the ground behind the car, was gone, taken by the two men who had just attempted to execute 3 people in the woods of Arkansas. It would take searchers 5 hours to find the patrol car. 5 hours of David Small lying in that trunk, wounded and waiting, existing in a space where hope and despair fought for dominance. When they finally opened that trunk and light flooded in, Small was still alive. Marvin Ritchie was still dead. And Opal James was still missing, driven away in the Ranger's truck toward an unknown location where his fate waited to be discovered. The manhunt that followed involved more than 100 people, helicopters circling over the Ouachita National Forest, armed citizens who grabbed their firearms and joined the search, a community suddenly aware that predators were moving through their landscape. People locked their doors that night. They kept their weapons close. The ordinary rhythms of rural life had been interrupted by something that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be bargained with, could only be found and stopped. But Ruiz and Van Denton were already 40 miles southwest of Magazine, moving down a series of back roads toward the Oklahoma state line with Opal James as their captive. They drove him to a secluded spot, another place where trees would absorb sound and distance would delay discovery. There, they ended his life with the same calculated violence they had demonstrated before. The unguarded door in McAllister had opened onto a trail of bodies stretching across 3 states. In less than a week, 2 escaped convicts had likely killed 6 people and wounded a 7th. And they still weren't finished. The Ranger's truck didn't belong to them any more than the patrol car had. Any more than any of the vehicles Ruiz and Van Denton had used since walking through that unguarded door in McAllister. But it served its purpose, carrying them away from the scene of their latest murders, putting distance between them and the bodies they'd left behind in the Arkansas woods. They drove the truck back into Oklahoma, crossing state lines as if borders were merely suggestions rather than boundaries. The landscape rolled past, the familiar territories of the South and Southwest, places where people lived ordinary lives, unaware that 2 men moving through their midst had already demonstrated a capacity for violence that seemed to have no natural limit. On July 1, 1977, in Purcell, Oklahoma, they encountered James Melvin Short. He was 40 years old, a cab driver, a man who made his living transporting strangers from one place to another. It was a profession built on trust, on the assumption that most people who climbed into the back of a taxi were simply trying to get somewhere, not trying to take something. Short's body was found 5 days later in Chickasha, Oklahoma, another man whose mistake had been existing in the path of predators who viewed human beings as resources to be exploited or eliminated. With Short's taxi, Ruiz and Van Denton finally had transportation that wouldn't immediately mark them as criminals. A taxi was anonymous, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that could travel long distances without attracting attention. They drove it northwest, leaving Oklahoma behind, crossing into states where their names and faces hadn't yet saturated the news media, where they were unknown and therefore dangerous in a way that known threats could never be. They drove all the way to Portland, Oregon. It was an extraordinary journey, thousands of miles from the scene of their escape, putting the entire width of the American West between them and the manhunt that was spreading across Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Portland in 1977 was a city experiencing its own transformation, growing and changing, absorbing new residents and travelers without much scrutiny. It was a good place to disappear, or at least a good place to believe you had disappeared. But Ruiz and Van Denton had made a critical error. They were running out of money, and in running out of money, they had to reach out. One of them contacted a family member back in Oklahoma, asking for financial assistance. It was a moment of ordinary human need, the need for money, for help, for some connection to the world they'd left behind, and it became the moment that ended their freedom. The family member didn't send money. The family member called the authorities instead, and suddenly the FBI knew exactly where the 2 escaped convicts were hiding. They were waiting for a money transfer that would never come, standing in a location that law enforcement had already surrounded, their brief taste of freedom already ending even as they stood there believing they were safe. On July 8, 1977, 15 days after walking through that unguarded door in McAllister, Paul Ruiz and Earl Van Denton were captured in Portland, Oregon. They weren't alone. With them was a 3rd man, David Christopherson, whom they had picked up hitchhiking somewhere in eastern Oregon. Christopherson was questioned and released. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, accepting a ride from men whose recent history he couldn't have known. The capture sparked an immediate legal battle over jurisdiction. Oklahoma wanted them for the murders committed there. Louisiana wanted them for the murders committed in their state. But Arkansas moved first and moved decisively. Governor David Pryor requested that Ruiz and Van Denton be extradited to Arkansas first, to stand trial for the murders of Marvin Ritchie and Opal James. After weeks of legal maneuvering, after lawyers argued and judges deliberated and bureaucrats negotiated, an agreement was reached in August 1977. The 2 men were sent back to Arkansas to stand trial in Logan County, where the crimes had occurred, where the memories were still fresh and the wounds still raw. The people of Magazine had waited through the summer for this moment, through the helicopters and the searches and the locked doors and the fear. Now they would have their chance to see justice done. The trial began on April 17, 1978, nearly 10 months after the murders. It was a spectacle from the start. 4 days of voir dire examination were required to select 13 jurors from a population that had been saturated with news coverage of the crimes. The Associated Press had released between 250 and 300 stories about the case, distributed to more than 100 newspapers. Practically everyone in Logan County knew who Ruiz and Van Denton were, what they were accused of doing, and where they had come from. The defense attorneys moved repeatedly for a change of venue, arguing that the pre-trial publicity had made it impossible for their clients to receive a fair trial in Logan County. Judge David Pertain denied the motion every time. The evidence was presented methodically, day after day, building a narrative of escape and violence that stretched across 3 states and at least 6 murders. But the most powerful testimony came from David Small, the ranger who had survived being shot in the trunk of Marvin Ritchie's patrol car. Small took the stand and identified Ruiz and Van Denton as the men who had kidnapped him, who had handcuffed him to the marshal, who had forced them both into that trunk where darkness and death waited. We had entered the park, and Ruiz and Denton blocked the road on us and jumped out of the police officer's vehicle. Small testified, his words careful and precise, bearing witness to trauma that would follow him for decades. He described how they were forced into the trunk, handcuffed together, how Ruiz stole his watch, how he heard the words that preceded the violence. "You know what we have to do." And the response, "Yes." Then came the shots and the darkness, and the minutes or hours of lying there wounded next to a dead man, waiting to be found or to die, whichever came first. On April 27, 1978, after 10 days of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned 47 minutes later with a verdict, guilty of capital murder on both counts. An hour after that, they returned with their sentencing recommendation: death. Both men were formally sentenced to die in the electric chair by Judge David Pertain. The execution date was set for December 4, 1978. But the American criminal justice system moves slowly, especially in capital cases, especially when questions of constitutional rights intersect with questions of life and death. The executions were stayed pending mandatory review by the Arkansas Supreme Court, and that review uncovered something the trial court had overlooked or dismissed. The pretrial publicity had been so extensive, so pervasive, that it may have indeed prejudiced the jury despite their assurances otherwise. The Arkansas Supreme Court overturned the convictions. Ruiz and Van Denton would have to be tried again, this time in a different county, somewhere the news coverage hadn't penetrated quite so deeply, somewhere a jury might be found that hadn't already formed opinions about their guilt. The second trial took place in 1983 in Morrilton, Conway County, 5 years after the first. New jurors, new courtroom, same evidence, same testimony, same outcome. Guilty on both counts. Death sentences for both men. But once again, the legal process wasn't finished. The 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals found problems with the death sentences, technical issues related to jury selection and sentencing procedures that violated the defendant's constitutional rights. The sentences were overturned. New sentencing hearings were required. The legal machinery ground forward through the 1980s and into the 1990s, through appeals and reviews and motions and briefs, through the painstaking process of ensuring that even men accused of multiple murders received the full protection of constitutional law. David Small testified 3 times in total, reliving that day in the woods 3 separate times, answering the same questions, identifying the same men, bearing witness to the same truth over and over again. "We'll believe it when we see it," he said years later, expressing the skepticism that had settled over Magazine like a permanent fog. The town had been waiting for justice since 1977, watching as the legal system performed its elaborate rituals, wondering if the men who had killed their marshal would ever actually face the ultimate consequence. The people of Magazine went on with their lives because that's what people do. Boyd Hicks, who had been 19 years old and newly married when Marvin Ritchie was killed, became the town marshal himself, taking on the same role his friend had held, serving the same community. He had a son who would graduate from high school, a son who had grown up in a town forever marked by what had happened on that June day in 1977. School Superintendent James Isaacs, who had been a teacher at the time of the murders, remembered testifying at the trials about seeing Richie drive down a country road toward a disabled car. It was just an ordinary observation, a moment glimpsed and forgotten until it became evidence, until it became part of the permanent record of that day's unraveling. Ruiz and Van Denton became fixtures on Arkansas's death row, aging in their cells while the legal process crawled forward. They became the longest-serving inmates awaiting execution in the state, arriving in 1978 after their initial convictions, still there as the years accumulated and the appeals multiplied and the execution dates came and went, stayed and rescheduled, theoretical rather than real. But eventually the appeals ran out. Eventually every court that could review the case had reviewed it. Eventually, the Arkansas Parole Board made its recommendation, and Governor Mike Huckabee declined to grant clemency. A final execution date was set, January 8, 1997, nearly 20 years after they had killed Marvin Ritchie and Opal James, nearly 20 years after that unguarded door had opened in McAllister. Paul Ruiz and Earl Van Denton would finally face the consequence that had been waiting for them since 1978. The winter of 1997 arrived cold in Arkansas, the kind of cold that settles into bones and doesn't leave, that turns the ground hard and makes the sky a uniform gray that seems to absorb all warmth and color. On January 8th, the temperature dropped further, and by evening, ice had begun to form on the roads leading to the Cummins unit of the Arkansas Department of Correction. Outside the governor's mansion in Little Rock, a vigil was being held. People stood in the cold, their breath visible in the darkness, their signs illuminated by streetlights and candles. Some opposed the death penalty on principle, believing that the state should not execute anyone regardless of their crimes. Others had more specific objections to this particular execution. But mostly, they stood in the cold because they believed that bearing witness mattered, that someone should mark the moment when the state took a life, even if that life belonged to a man who had taken multiple lives himself. At the Cummins unit, preparations had been underway for hours. 3 men were scheduled to die that night, an extraordinary convergence of executions that would mark only the second time since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976 that 3 people would be executed on the same date in the same state. The logistics were complex, the schedule tight, the emotional toll on the prison staff anticipated and accepted as part of their duty. Paul Ruiz, now 49 years old, would be executed first at 7 o'clock. Earl Van Denton, 47 years old, would follow. Then Kurt Douglas Wainwright, 30 years old, convicted of the 1988 robbery murder of a convenience store clerk named Barbara Smith in Prescott. 3 men, 3 crimes, 3 lives that would end before midnight in a ritual that the state of Arkansas had designed to be as clinical and impersonal as death could be made when delivered by bureaucratic procedure. The stated justification for executing all 3 men on the same night was efficiency. It would save money on overtime costs for prison officials, and it would spare those officials the psychological burden of preparing for 3 separate execution dates. But the decision had sparked controversy and criticism from those who believed it reduced the gravity of execution to a matter of convenience, who felt that if the state was going to take a life, it should at least do so with singular focus rather than assembly line efficiency. Victims and relatives of victims were not allowed to witness the executions according to Arkansas law at that time, but several were present at the prison, waiting outside, needing to be there even if they couldn't see the moment when the sentences were finally carried out. For the people of Magazine, particularly those who had known Marvin Ritchie or had lived through that June day in 1977, the wait had been almost incomprehensibly long. 20 years. 2 decades of appeals and retrials and legal maneuvering, 2 decades of wondering if justice would ever be delivered, 2 decades of watching Ruiz and Van Denton age in their cells while the wounds in Magazine remained unhealed. David Small was 47 years old now, the same age as Van Denton. He had survived being shot in the chest and left for dead in the trunk of a patrol car, survived testifying 3 times at 3 separate trials, survived 2 decades of carrying that day with him wherever he went. Perhaps no one is more disgusted with the execution delays than 47-year-old David Small. A journalist had written in the days before the execution. Small had waited longer than anyone, carrying his survival as both a gift and a burden, living the life that Marvin Ritchie and Opal James had been denied. Inside the death chamber, the preparations were methodical. The gurney waited, the IVs were ready, the chemicals that would stop a human heart were measured and prepared. The state of Arkansas had moved from the electric chair to lethal injection, a method considered more humane, more clinical, less prone to the grotesque malfunctions that sometimes occurred when electricity was used to end life. Now death would come through chemicals: sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to paralyze the respiratory muscles, potassium chloride to stop the heart. A pharmaceutical execution, death delivered through modern medicine's tools turned toward a purpose their creators never intended. At 7:09 p.m., Earl Van Denton was declared dead. He had not delivered a final statement. Some condemned prisoners used their last words to proclaim innocence, to offer apologies, to make peace with God or family or the world they were leaving. Van Denton said nothing. He was led into the death chamber, strapped to the gurney, connected to the 4 lines that would deliver the fatal chemicals, and he died without speaking. Whatever thoughts he had in those final moments, whatever regrets or defiance or fear existed in his mind, he kept them to himself. 51 minutes later, at 8 p.m., Paul Ruiz was declared dead. He too had declined to offer a final statement. Like Van Denton, he faced his execution in silence, taking whatever he knew, whatever he felt, whatever small piece of his humanity remained, into oblivion without sharing it with the witnesses gathered to watch him die. They had been the longest-serving inmates on Arkansas's death row, arriving in 1978 after their initial convictions, spending nearly 19 years in a limbo that existed somewhere between life and death, between punishment and its final expression. Now they were gone, erased from the world by the same state whose laws they had violated so profoundly in the summer of 1977. Kurt Douglas Wainwright followed them into death later that night, completing the triple execution that would become part of Arkansas's history, a footnote in the long and troubled story of capital punishment in America. Outside the prison, those who had gathered to bear witness dispersed into the cold night, driving home on icy roads, returning to lives that would continue in a world where Ruiz and Van Denton no longer existed. In Little Rock, the vigil outside the governor's mansion ended. In Magazine, the news arrived that the wait was finally over, that justice, delayed by nearly 2 decades but finally delivered, had been accomplished. But what did justice mean in this context? What had been balanced by those 3 executions? Marvin Ritchie was still dead. Opal James was still dead. Jimmy Cockrells, Ray Jones, Alton Wilson, Gerald Tiffey, Melvin Short, all still dead. Their lives ended in the summer of 1977 by men who had treated murder as casually as most people treat flat tires or wrong turns. David Small still carried the scar on his chest and the memories in his mind, still lived with the knowledge that he had survived something that should have killed him. The executions couldn't restore any of that. They couldn't give back the years, couldn't heal the wounds, couldn't erase the trauma or bring back the dead. All they could do was end 2 more lives, officially and legally, with witnesses and procedures and the imprimatur of state authority. Whether that constituted justice or simply vengeance, whether it brought closure or just finality, whether it served any purpose beyond satisfying society's need to impose consequences for evil actions. These were questions without easy answers, questions that the people of Magazine and Arkansas and America would continue to debate long after that cold night in January 1997 had passed into history. What remained unambiguous was the body count. 10 lives had been fundamentally altered or ended by that unguarded door in McAllister. 6 people almost certainly murdered, 1 wounded and traumatized, 2 executed by the state, and 1. Elmer Finnan, the 3rd escapee who had separated from Ruiz and Van Denton almost immediately, whose fate remained unknown, absorbed into the vast American landscape like so many others who disappear and are never found. The people of Magazine could finally move forward, but moving forward didn't mean forgetting. Small towns remember. They remember their dead. They remember their tragedies. They remember the days when darkness came to visit and left scars that never fully healed. Marvin Ritchie's name would remain on the memorial wall, his sacrifice honored by the town he had tried to protect. Boyd Hicks would continue serving as town marshal, carrying forward the role his friend had died performing. And somewhere in the memories of those who had lived through it, that June day in 1977 would remain forever present, forever fresh, a wound that time could fade but never fully close. In the years that followed the executions, the case of Paul Ruiz and Earl Van Denton became part of the historical record, documented in court files and newspaper archives and the collective memory of those who had lived through it. But history is never as simple as documentation suggests, and the questions that remained were as persistent as the grief that never fully resolved. The most fundamental question was the oldest one. Why? Why did two men who were already serving life sentences for violent crimes decide to walk through that unguarded door? They had nothing to gain except temporary freedom, freedom that would inevitably end in capture or death. They must have known this. They weren't stupid men. Prison doesn't make anyone smarter, but it does teach certain brutal lessons about consequences and power and the limits of human agency. Yet they walked through that door anyway, and once through it, they embarked on a killing spree that seemed to serve no purpose beyond satisfying some internal compulsion toward violence. Perhaps the answer was simpler than it appeared. Some people, when given the opportunity to hurt others, will take it. The opportunity theory of crime suggests that much criminal behavior isn't driven by elaborate motivation but by the convergence of opportunity and lack of restraint. Ruiz and Van Denton were violent men. They had demonstrated this before their escape. Van Denton with his brutal murder of William Droke in 1970, Ruiz with his armed robbery conviction. Prison had not reformed them. It had merely contained them. When containment failed, when that door went unguarded, they reverted to what they were. But even this explanation feels incomplete. Most escaped convicts, even violent ones, don't immediately embark on multi-state murder sprees. Most flee, hide, try to establish new identities or reach safe havens where they can disappear. The violence that Ruiz and Van Denton engaged in seemed almost gratuitous, excessive even by the standards of criminal behavior. They didn't have to kill Gerald Tiffey. They could have simply stolen his truck. They didn't have to kill Ray Jones and Alton Wilson. They could have avoided the fishermen entirely. They didn't have to kill Marvin Ritchie and Opal James. They already had the patrol car and could have simply fled. Each murder was a choice, and each choice revealed something about the men making it. They chose violence not because it was necessary, but because, in some fundamental way, they wanted to. Or perhaps wanted is the wrong word. Perhaps it was more like an addiction, each killing creating a psychological need for the next one, a descent into a moral void where human life ceased to have meaning beyond its instrumental value or its availability as a target. The psychiatrists and psychologists who evaluated Ruiz and Van Denton during their years on death row never released detailed public reports of their findings, but certain patterns are visible in the biographical information that survived. Van Denton's first known murder, the killing of William Droke in 1970, was characterized by extraordinary brutality, beating a man with a bottle, then a telephone receiver, then finally a shovel until life left the body. This wasn't a murder committed in the heat of passion or during a robbery gone wrong. This was sustained, deliberate violence, the kind that required commitment and effort and a complete absence of empathy. Ruiz's criminal record before his escape was less violent. Armed robbery rather than murder. But the fact that he partnered so seamlessly with Van Denton after the escape suggests he possessed similar capacities for violence that simply hadn't been fully expressed until the opportunity arose. Prison partnerships are revealing. Men choose their associates based on compatibility, on shared values and temperaments. That Ruiz and Van Denton stayed together from the moment of escape through their capture in Portland, that they coordinated so effectively in kidnapping and killing multiple people, suggests they recognized something in each other that permitted and perhaps encouraged the violence they committed together. The question of the third escapee, Elmer Finnan, remains one of the case's minor mysteries. He separated from Ruiz and Van Denton almost immediately after the escape and was never connected to any of the subsequent murders. Was this wisdom or luck? Did Finnan recognize something in his fellow escapees that frightened him? Or did he simply have different goals that didn't align with their path? Whatever his reasons, separating from them probably saved his life and certainly saved him from being implicated in their crimes. His fate after the separation remains unknown. He either successfully disappeared into a new life, or he was captured and returned to prison, or he died somewhere in obscurity. The historical record is silent on Elmer Finnan's ultimate destination. For David Small, the survivor, the questions were more personal and more enduring. He had lain in that trunk next to Marvin Ritchie's body, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the chest, waiting to be found or to die. He had testified 3 times, identifying his attackers, describing in careful detail what they had done. He had waited 20 years for their executions. When they finally occurred, when Ruiz and Van Denton were declared dead and their names moved from the roster of living inmates to the roster of the executed, did that bring David Small peace? The available evidence suggests it brought something less than peace but more than nothing. A kind of closure that wasn't satisfying but was at least final. Perhaps no one is more disgusted with the execution delays than 47-year-old David Small. The journalist wrote, and that disgust speaks to the way protracted legal proceedings can prevent emotional wounds from healing. Every appeal, every retrial, every stay of execution reopened the wound, forced Small to relive that day again, reminded him that the men who had tried to kill him were still alive while his colleague Ritchie remained dead. After the executions, Small could at least know that Ruiz and Van Denton were no longer in the world, that they could never escape again, could never hurt anyone else. Whether this knowledge provided comfort or merely ended a chapter of prolonged suffering is something only Small could answer, and he chose to maintain a private dignity in the years that followed, declining most interview requests, living his life away from the public attention that the case had brought him. The town of Magazine, too, had to find its way forward. Small towns are both resilient and fragile. They survive tragedies, but they don't forget them. The murder of the town marshal became part of Magazine's identity, a defining event that separated the time before from the time after. Older residents remembered Marvin Ritchie personally, remembered him as a neighbor and friend, remembered the day he drove out to help some stranded motorists and never came back. Younger residents grew up knowing the story, hearing about it in school or from parents, understanding that something terrible had happened here once, that their peaceful town had been touched by violence. Boyd Hicks, who became town marshal after having been a friend of Marvin Ritchie, embodied this transition. He was 19 when Ritchie died, newly married, just beginning his adult life. 20 years later, he was the marshal, holding the same position his friend had held, serving the same community. There's something both poignant and affirming in this continuity. The role that Ritchie died performing was taken up by someone who remembered him, who understood what the job had cost and chose to do it anyway. The institutional failures that enabled the escape also prompted questions that extended beyond the immediate tragedy. How does an unguarded door happen? How does a prison work detail end up with 3 violent offenders placed in an empty building during lunch break with no supervision? The 2 guards who were demoted and suspended took the immediate blame, but systemic failures are rarely about individual mistakes. They're about procedures that aren't followed, about resources that aren't allocated, about organizational cultures that permit complacency until catastrophe reveals the consequences. Oklahoma's prison system in 1977 was underfunded and understaffed, like most prison systems before and since. Guards were overworked, procedures were shortcuts, and the work details that took inmates outside prison walls were always vulnerable to exactly this kind of failure. The tragedy was that the failure cost not just the prison system's credibility, but multiple innocent lives. Gerald Tiffey, Jimmy Cockrells, Ray Jones, Alton Wilson, Marvin Ritchie, Opal James, Melvin Short. 7 people whose deaths might have been prevented if that door had been properly guarded. Could they have been prevented? The counterfactual question is unanswerable but irresistible. If that door had been guarded, if Ruiz and Van Denton had remained imprisoned, would those 7 people have lived full lives? Almost certainly. Would Ruiz and Van Denton have eventually gotten out of prison through parole or sentence commutation and hurt someone then? Possibly, though less likely than the certainty of what actually happened. The unguarded door created a specific chain of causation that led to specific deaths, and while we can't know what alternative futures might have existed, we can know that those alternative futures would have been different from what occurred. The legal journey from escape to execution took 20 years, and in those 20 years, the American criminal justice system revealed both its strengths and its profound limitations. The system worked in the sense that Ruiz and Van Denton were caught, tried, convicted, and ultimately executed. The system failed in the sense that it took 2 decades to reach that conclusion, during which David Small and the people of magazine had to wait and wonder and relive the trauma again and again. The multiple trials and appeals revealed the system's commitment to constitutional protections even for men accused of heinous crimes. The Arkansas Supreme Court overturned the first convictions because pretrial publicity had likely prejudiced the jury. The federal appeals courts overturned sentencing decisions because procedures hadn't been properly followed. These weren't technicalities in the dismissive sense. They were fundamental protections designed to ensure that even the guilty receive fair treatment under law. But fairness has costs. It costs time, it costs money, it costs emotional energy from victims and survivors who have to wait while the machinery of justice performs its elaborate rituals. Is this cost worth paying? The question divides people along philosophical lines that rarely admit compromise. Those who support capital punishment often see the appeals process as excessive, as providing more protection to murderers than to their victims. Those who oppose capital punishment see the lengthy appeals as necessary but ultimately futile, as merely delaying an unjust execution rather than preventing it. What no one disputes is that Ruiz and Van Denton murdered multiple people during their 2-week flight from justice. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness testimony compelling, the pattern of violence unmistakable. If ever there were a case that seemed to justify capital punishment from a pure desert perspective, the idea that some acts are so evil they merit the ultimate penalty, this was it. Yet even in this case, questions persist. Does executing murderers make society safer? The answer is ambiguous. Ruiz and Van Denton could never hurt anyone else after their executions, but they also couldn't hurt anyone else during their 20 years on death row. Does execution deter others from committing similar crimes? The criminological evidence suggests it does not. Murder rates don't correlate with the use of capital punishment in ways that suggest deterrent effects. Does execution provide closure to victims and survivors? Sometimes, but not always. David Small's experience suggests that closure is more complex than the simple finality of an execution. What remains, after all the questions and analyses and moral debates, is the irreducible fact of the suffering caused. 7 people died violently, their lives cut short by men who viewed them as obstacles or opportunities rather than as human beings with intrinsic worth. 1 man survived but carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. Families lost loved ones. A community lost its sense of safety and innocence. And while the executions of Ruiz and Van Denton ended one chapter of the story, they couldn't erase what had been written in blood across 3 states during that terrible summer of 1977. The unguarded door remains the central image of this story, the mundane failure that opened onto catastrophe, the moment when containment failed and violence was loosed into the world. Every prison system has unguarded doors, literal or metaphorical. Every society has violent people who, given the opportunity, will hurt others. The challenge is maintaining the guards, securing the doors, preventing the convergence of opportunity and violence that creates tragedies like this one. We don't always succeed. The case of Earl Van Denton and Paul Ruiz proves that systems fail, that violence happens, that innocent people die because someone somewhere made a mistake or took a shortcut or failed to imagine the worst-case scenario until it was already unfolding. The lesson, if there is one, is not that we can prevent all such tragedies, but that we must try, must maintain the vigilance and the resources and the procedures that make tragedies less likely, even if we can never make them impossible. In the end, the story of Earl Van Denton is a story about many things: violence and justice, punishment and vengeance, failure and consequences, survival and memory. But perhaps most fundamentally, it's a story about a door that should have been guarded and wasn't, and about all the lives that were changed or ended because of that one seemingly small mistake. The door that opened in McAllister on June 23, 1977, led to a road that stretched across 3 states and 2 decades, a road marked by bodies and blood and sorrow, a road that finally ended in a death chamber in Arkansas on a cold January night. The door is closed now. The men who walked through it are gone, but the consequences of that moment remain, woven into the history of small towns and the memories of survivors, a permanent reminder that some mistakes can never be taken back, that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our final story. Story 3. The Tamiami Trail Predator. Some men carry darkness so quietly that it moves beside them like a second skin, unnoticed until it consumes everything in its path. In the spring of 2003, Magnolia, Delaware existed as one of those small communities where neighbors still knew each other's names, where the rhythm of life moved slowly through mobile home parks and tree-lined streets. Irish Hill Road was a modest stretch of working-class homes, the kind of place where people waved from their porches and left their doors unlocked during the day. It was the sort of neighborhood where violence seemed impossible, where tragedy belonged to other places, other people. The residents were working-class families, retirees on fixed incomes, single parents struggling to make ends meet, ordinary Americans living ordinary lives in the kind of community that exists in thousands of places across the country, anonymous and unremarkable until something terrible happens. The mobile homes along Irish Hill Road had that weathered look that comes from years of Delaware seasons. The aluminum siding dulled by winter storms and summer heat, small gardens struggling in sandy soil, vehicles parked in driveways that were more dirt than gravel. It was humble but maintained, the kind of place where people took pride in keeping up their properties even if those properties would never appear in home magazines or real estate listings. Children rode bicycles along the narrow streets. Neighbors borrowed tools and returned them. Life proceeded with the comfortable predictability that defines small-town existence. Albert C. Harris Sr. was 51 years old that April, a man whose life had become routine in the way that brings comfort to some and quiet desperation to others. His mobile home sat like dozens of others along the street, its aluminum siding catching the afternoon light, its small windows revealing nothing of the man who lived within. He kept to himself mostly, maintained the unspoken boundaries that define neighborly relationships in close quarters. What conversations he had were brief, unremarkable exchanges about weather or weekend plans. Those who knew Harris, and few really did, would later struggle to piece together a complete picture of the man. He had worked various jobs over the years, nothing glamorous or particularly lucrative, the kind of employment that pays bills without building wealth. He had family somewhere, though they weren't regular visitors to the mobile home on Irish Hill Road. He had habits and routines, places he went and things he did, a life that was full in ways that mattered to him even if it appeared limited to outside observers. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who populates communities like Magnolia, someone living quietly, bothering no one, expecting nothing more than to continue existing in peace. On that same street, just houses away, lived William Jeffrey Devonshire. At 33, he had already accumulated a criminal history that read like a slow descent into depravity. Born in Wilmington on September 23, 1969, Devonshire had begun his criminal career at 14, a child learning the language of violence before he could legally drive. The path from troubled teenager to violent adult criminal had been remarkably direct, unmarked by the rehabilitation successes or transformation narratives that the justice system occasionally produces. By the time he became Harris's neighbor, Devonshire had been arrested more than 69 times across 5 states: Delaware, Maryland, Indiana, Ohio, and New Jersey. The geographic spread of his offenses suggested a restless existence, a person who moved from place to place, perhaps seeking fresh starts that never materialized or fleeing consequences that eventually caught up with him anyway. The charges formed a disturbing pattern: assault, aggravated assault, disorderly conduct, battery, burglary, trespassing, domestic battery, sexual battery, robbery. Each arrest was a warning sign, a red flag that the system saw and then, time and again, released back into the world. What creates a person like William Devonshire remains one of those questions that society struggles to answer satisfactorily. Public records provide little insight into his childhood, no documentation of abuse or neglect or trauma that might explain the violence that defined his adult life. Perhaps that information exists somewhere, buried in sealed juvenile records or in the memories of people who knew him before he became what he was. Or perhaps his childhood was unremarkable, proving that monsters can emerge from anywhere, that the capacity for extreme violence doesn't always announce itself through obvious warning signs in youth. The exact nature of Devonshire and Harris's relationship remains unclear, lost to the silence that surrounds such crimes. Were they merely neighbors who nodded in passing? Had they shared beers on summer evenings, discussing nothing of consequence? Or had there been tension between them, small conflicts that escalated in Devonshire's mind until they demanded resolution? The records do not say, and those who might know have remained silent or cannot speak. What is known is this: on April 6, 2003, Albert C. Harris Sr. died inside his mobile home. When his body was discovered, the scene told a story of extreme violence. Harris had been bludgeoned to death, struck repeatedly with an object that was never identified or recovered. The attack had been savage, sustained, personal in its brutality. This was not a robbery gone wrong or a crime of sudden passion that immediately regretted itself. This was rage given physical form, a darkness that had waited for its moment and then consumed everything in its path. The mobile home park erupted with the kind of fear that small communities know too well. Police cars filled the narrow streets, their lights painting the aluminum homes in alternating shades of red and blue. Neighbors emerged from their dwellings, drawn by the commotion, speaking in hushed voices about the impossibility of what had happened. Murder in Magnolia was rare enough to be shocking, but murder in a mobile home park, where walls were thin and sounds carried, where everyone knew everyone else's business, that was something else entirely. It shattered the illusion of safety that places like Irish Hill Road depend upon, the belief that bad things happen elsewhere, to other people in different circumstances. Delaware State Police secured the scene quickly, their practiced efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos around them. Inside the mobile home, evidence technicians worked methodically, photographing, documenting, collecting samples that would later prove crucial. The weapon was never recovered, but the violence it had inflicted was evident in every corner of that small space. Blood spatter told the story of Harris's final moments, a narrative written in crimson across walls and furniture, a testament to how brutally a human life can end when another person decides it should. Devonshire's proximity to the victim made him an immediate person of interest. His criminal record, extensive as it was, had never included murder, but the pattern was there for anyone willing to see it. Violence had been escalating in his life for nearly 2 decades, each arrest a step closer to something irreversible. The investigators knew what they were looking at. A man who had been building toward this moment for years, whose capacity for violence had finally found its ultimate expression. The arrest came quickly. Within days, Devonshire was in custody, charged with first-degree murder and possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony. The community breathed easier, believing that justice would be swift, that the monster who had shattered their peace would be locked away forever. They could not have known that this was merely the beginning, that the darkness Devonshire carried would claim more lives before it was finally contained. On January 5, 2004, a grand jury handed down the indictment. The case moved through the Delaware Superior Court with the grinding deliberation that defines the American justice system. Devonshire attempted to delay proceedings, using every legal mechanism available to postpone his reckoning. But by 2005, he stood trial and was convicted of second-degree murder. The reduction from first-degree murder to second-degree remains unexplained in public records. Perhaps it was a plea arrangement, perhaps the prosecution faced evidentiary challenges, perhaps it was simply the result of legal maneuvering by a defense attorney doing their job. Whatever the reason, that reduction would prove consequential in ways no one could have predicted. The sentence he received seemed substantial at the time. Years in prison, time to reflect on what he had done, to perhaps find some path toward redemption or at least containment. Devonshire entered the Howard R. Young Correctional Institution, a place that should have held him until the darkness inside him withered and died. Instead, it became merely a pause, an intermission in a performance that was far from over. Behind bars, he was one predator among many, his particular brand of violence unremarkable in a population defined by its capacity for harm. He served his time without significant incident, at least none that made it into official records. He followed the rules, or at least followed them enough to avoid additional consequences. The years passed with the peculiar timelessness that characterizes incarceration. In 2013, after serving only 8 years of his sentence, William Devonshire walked free. The parole board had reviewed his case and deemed him suitable for release. Whatever criteria they used, whatever risk assessment tools they employed, they concluded that this man, who had bludgeoned a neighbor to death, who carried nearly 7 decades of prior arrests, who had demonstrated a pattern of escalating violence throughout his entire adult life, was safe to return to society. The state of Delaware released him, and William Devonshire pointed himself south, toward Florida, toward sunshine and beaches and tourists and the kind of anonymity that only a transient population can provide. Behind him, he left a murder solved and punished, at least in the eyes of the law. Before him lay a future that those who studied his file might have predicted. Had anyone been watching, had anyone been paying attention. But no one was watching closely enough. And William Devonshire disappeared into the mass of humanity that flows through Florida's cities and beaches. One more drifter among thousands, carrying his darkness with him like luggage, waiting for the moment when it would demand to be opened once again. Florida absorbs people the way the ocean absorbs rain, completely without trace, as if they had never existed anywhere else. When William Devonshire arrived in Sarasota County in November 2013, he was 44 years old, recently released from prison after serving time for murder, and carrying the kind of history that should have followed him like a warning siren. Instead, he slipped into the city's transient population as easily as a shadow merges with darkness, becoming one more face among thousands of homeless individuals who moved through the streets largely unseen by those with homes and addresses. Sarasota's beauty is deceptive. The white sand beaches and turquoise waters, the upscale shopping districts and cultural venues, all paint a picture of prosperity and leisure that appears in tourism brochures and real estate advertisements. But beneath this glossy surface exists another reality entirely. A population of homeless individuals, struggling addicts, mentally ill people without adequate care, and marginalized humans living in the spaces between the tourist attractions. The northern section of Tamiami Trail, that historic highway running through the heart of the city, had become a corridor where these two worlds occasionally intersected, where wealth and poverty existed in uncomfortable proximity. Devonshire's arrival in Florida was marked not with fanfare but with violence. Within days of crossing the state line, driving a 1995 green Dodge with Delaware license plate 361239, he had a woman in his car. When she refused his advances, he attacked her. The woman managed to escape near the intersection of East Dearborn Street and North Indiana Avenue in Englewood, throwing herself from the moving vehicle in desperation, choosing the risk of injury from pavement over whatever Devonshire intended to do to her. Fortune, that fickle companion, placed a Sarasota County Sheriff's deputy nearby. The officer intervened, and Devonshire was arrested on battery charges, his first mark in Florida's criminal record system. It should have been a warning. It should have triggered a deeper look into this newcomer with Delaware plates and violent tendencies, this man whose background check would have revealed a murder conviction and decades of violent offenses. Instead, it became one more data point in an overwhelmed system, one more case processed and filed away. The battery charge was handled through the standard procedures. Devonshire faced consequences proportional to a single battery arrest, and then the system moved on to the next case, the next emergency, the next crisis demanding immediate attention. But Devonshire did not move on. Over the following years, he wove himself into the fabric of Sarasota's homeless community, a predator hiding in plain sight among the vulnerable. He accumulated more arrests like others might collect parking tickets. Trespassing, drug possession, multiple battery charges, each one processed through a system that seemed incapable of recognizing the pattern. In December 2015, he was arrested for battery by strangulation and kidnapping, an incident near the 10th Street boat ramp that should have sent every alarm bell ringing throughout the justice system. During that 2015 arrest, Devonshire reportedly told his victim something chilling. "I'll kill you just like I killed him," a direct reference to his Delaware murder conviction. He was using his history of lethal violence as a weapon of intimidation, demonstrating both his willingness to kill and his confidence that he could do so again without facing ultimate consequences. The victim survived, traumatized but alive, and pressed charges. The case moved forward through the initial stages of prosecution. Then the state attorney's office made a decision that would haunt them later. They dropped the charges. The reasons remain frustratingly unclear. Perhaps the victim became uncooperative, frightened into silence by Devonshire's threats. Perhaps there were evidentiary issues that made conviction seem unlikely. Perhaps it was simply a matter of prosecutorial resources being directed toward cases that seemed more winnable, more significant, more demanding of limited time and attention. Whatever the reason, Devonshire walked free once again, his confidence perhaps bolstered by yet another escape from meaningful consequences. In August 2017, Devonshire's behavior escalated once more. He was arrested for burglary and multiple counts of battery. This time, the system held firm. He was convicted on January 24, 2018, and sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in Florida's prison system. It was a significant sentence, one that should have provided breathing room for his potential victims, a period during which he would be locked away and unable to harm anyone new. He served his time at an unnamed facility, one more inmate among thousands, his particular history lost in the mass of criminal records and institutional routines. On June 20, 2020, William Devonshire was released back into Sarasota. The COVID-19 pandemic had transformed the city in ways both visible and invisible. Beaches had been closed for months, businesses shuttered, tourists absent. The homeless population faced particular hardships as charitable services reduced operations and public spaces closed. For someone like Devonshire, the pandemic created both challenges and opportunities: fewer resources available, but also less scrutiny, less attention from authorities focused on managing a public health crisis. Devonshire returned to the streets he knew, to the transient lifestyle that provided cover for his predatory nature. By early 2022, he had become a fixture around certain areas of Sarasota, particularly the northern section of Tamiami Trail. Those who knew him from the streets would later describe him in vague, non-committal terms. A drifter, a sometimes aggressive presence, someone to be wary of but not necessarily feared above the baseline wariness that homeless individuals must maintain as a survival mechanism. He blended in with the other homeless individuals who gathered in parks and under bridges, who made use of boat ramps and wooded areas for shelter and privacy. To the tourists driving past on their way to beaches and restaurants, Devonshire was invisible, just one more homeless person among many, part of the scenery that middle-class visitors trained themselves not to see. To the police, he was a known quantity, someone with a record but not an active, urgent threat. To the women who would become his victims, he was simply another person in their marginalized world, someone whose true nature remained hidden until it was far too late. The question that would later haunt investigators and prosecutors was simple but profound. How many chances does one person deserve? How many times can someone demonstrate a capacity for violence before society says enough, before the pattern is recognized as destiny rather than aberration? Devonshire had been arrested more than 70 times across 6 states. He had murdered a man in Delaware, served only 8 years, and been released. He had attacked women repeatedly in Florida. He had explicitly threatened to kill again, referencing his prior murder as evidence of his capability. And yet, again and again, he was released, given another opportunity, another chance to prove he could be something other than what he clearly was. In the homeless camps and gathering places around Sarasota, life continued its precarious rhythm. People shared resources when they could, looked out for each other within the limits of their own survival needs, and tried to navigate the daily challenges of existence without stable housing. Vulnerability was a constant companion. Vulnerability to weather, to hunger, to violence, to all the dangers that come with living on the margins of society. Among them moved William Devonshire, a man who had killed before and would kill again, whose presence among the vulnerable was like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. It was not a question of whether he would hurt someone else, but when, not a possibility but an inevitability that everyone missed or chose not to see. The northern Tamiami Trail runs through Sarasota like a vein, carrying traffic and commerce and tourists unaware of the human dramas playing out in its margins. Along this corridor, near boat ramps and wooded areas, beneath bridges and in parks, people invisible to most of society carved out temporary existences. They were someone's children, someone's parents, people whose lives had taken turns that led them to streets and shelters instead of homes and security. They were vulnerable in ways that the housed and stable can barely comprehend, exposed not just to weather and hunger but to predators who understood that their deaths might go unnoticed or unmourned, that justice for the marginalized often comes slowly if at all. February 2022 arrived with the false promise of spring, the temperatures warming after Florida's brief winter, tourists beginning to return as pandemic restrictions eased. Life was returning to some semblance of normalcy, or at least what passed for normal in a world forever changed. For William Devonshire, now 52 years old and living without shelter, the month would mark the culmination of a lifetime of violence, the moment when his carefully concealed darkness would finally be fully revealed. But before that revelation came two women who deserved better than what they got, two lives that should have been protected and weren't, two murders that might have been prevented if the system had worked as it should, if the warnings had been heeded, if society had valued the lives of homeless women the way it valued the lives of those with addresses and bank accounts. Their names were Kellyanne Ripley and Vicki Levitch, and they were about to intersect with William Devonshire's life in the worst possible way. The morning of February 25, 2022, dawned clear over Sarasota, the kind of winter day that reminds people why Florida exists in the American imagination as paradise. The temperature hovered in the comfortable mid-70s, the humidity was low, the sky a crystalline blue that seemed to promise nothing but good things. Along the northern section of Tamiami Trail, early morning traffic began its familiar flow. People heading to work or breakfast, tourists consulting maps and planning their days, all of them unaware that in a wooded area near Centennial Park, something terrible had already happened. Kellyanne Ripley was 48 years old. The details of her life before homelessness remain largely private, protected by the dignity that her family tried to preserve even in death. What is known is that she had been living without stable housing in Sarasota, part of the invisible population that moved through the city's margins, utilizing resources where she could find them, surviving day by day in the way that those without homes must do. She was, by all accounts, a person, not a statistic, not a cautionary tale, but a human being with a history and relationships and the same fundamental desire for safety that everyone carries. The wooded area near the Centennial Park boat ramp was the kind of place homeless individuals often used for privacy and rest. Tucked away from the main traffic flow in the 1100 block of North Tamiami Trail, screened by vegetation, it offered a measure of seclusion that was valuable to those living on the streets. It was not an official campsite, but rather one of those informal spaces that developed organically, known to those who needed to know, invisible to everyone else. On that February morning, someone discovered Ripley's body there, nestled in the undergrowth, positioned in a way that might have appeared peaceful from a distance but revealed something horrific upon closer examination. The Sarasota Police Department responded quickly, their vehicles converging on the scene with practiced efficiency. Crime scene tape went up, creating a perimeter that would keep out the curious and preserve whatever evidence remained. Detectives arrived, their faces betraying nothing of what they felt as they surveyed the scene, taking in details that would later form the foundation of their investigation. The body position, the surrounding environment, the absence or presence of personal belongings. Every observation mattered. Every detail could be the key that unlocked what had happened in this small wooded space. On February 26th, the medical examiner's office completed its autopsy. The findings were as brutal as they were clear. Kellyanne Ripley had died from blunt force trauma combined with manual strangulation. She had been beaten and then choked to death, her final moments a horror that no one should have to endure. The violence inflicted upon her was extreme, personal, sustained. This was not a death that happened quickly. This was murder in its rawest form, life being forcibly extracted from a body that had tried desperately to hold on to it, fought for survival until fighting was no longer possible. The police department was careful about releasing information. In homicide investigations, certain details must be protected, not out of disrespect for the public's right to know, but to preserve the integrity of the case. The method of death, specific evidence from the scene, the victim's identity. All of these were initially withheld, released only when investigators deemed it appropriate or when the victim's family gave permission. Ripley's family, in their grief, eventually allowed her name to be made public, a decision that transformed her from Jane Doe into a real person with a real identity, someone whose loss could be properly mourned. The investigation that followed was methodical and exhaustive. Detectives canvassed the area, speaking with anyone who might have seen something, anyone who knew Ripley or frequented the same space as she did. They recovered her cell phone and used it to trace her last known movements, piecing together a timeline of her final hours. The technology of modern policing came into play. Surveillance cameras from businesses and traffic lights captured footage that was reviewed frame by frame. Cell tower data placed people in specific locations at specific times. Forensic analysis of biological evidence began the slow process of identifying whose DNA had been left at the scene. On March 10, 2022, just 13 days after Ripley's body was discovered, history repeated itself with terrifying precision. The body of 59-year-old Vicki Levitch was found near Whitaker Bayou in the 1900 block of North Tamiami Trail. The location was less than a mile from where Ripley had been found, close enough to suggest a connection, far enough to indicate that the killer was comfortable moving through the area, that he knew these spaces and how to use them for his purposes. Levitch, like Ripley, had been living without stable housing. The circumstances that led her to the streets were her own, complex and likely involving the kind of setbacks that can happen to anyone: job loss, illness, family estrangement, the accumulation of small disasters that eventually add up to homelessness. And like Ripley, she had been extensively beaten and manually strangled. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore. The method of death, the locations, the victimology. Everything pointed toward a single perpetrator, someone hunting in the margins of society, targeting women who were vulnerable, whose deaths he perhaps believed would go unnoticed or uninvestigated with the same vigor afforded to victims from more privileged circumstances. Under Massey's law, which protects the privacy rights of crime victims and their families, Levitch's identity was initially withheld. Her family struggled with the decision about whether to allow her name to be released publicly, weighing the desire for privacy against the need to acknowledge her humanity, to assert that her life had mattered and her death deserved justice. The police department now faced the sobering reality that they were investigating 2 murders in less than 2 weeks. Additional resources were deployed immediately. The homeless outreach team, typically focused on connecting people with services and resources, now worked alongside detectives, their knowledge of the street population and homeless gathering places proving invaluable. Officers increased patrols along the northern Tamiami Trail, their presence both protective and investigative, trying to prevent additional murders while gathering information about the 2 that had already occurred. Within the homeless community, fear spread like wildfire. People who normally stayed in certain areas moved elsewhere, seeking safety in unfamiliar locations. Women who usually walked alone began traveling in groups, the buddy system becoming an unofficial policy born of desperation. Trust, already a scarce commodity among people living on the streets, became even more carefully guarded. Everyone knew someone who knew one or both of the victims. Everyone understood that they could be next, that homelessness made them targets rather than citizens deserving of protection. The detectives working the cases knew they were in a race against time. Serial killers typically don't stop on their own. They continue until they're caught or until they become physically unable to continue their crimes. The 13-day gap between murders was concerning. It suggested someone emboldened by his initial success, someone who felt safe enough to kill again quickly, someone whose confidence was growing rather than diminishing. If they didn't identify and apprehend the killer soon, there would almost certainly be more victims. Evidence from both scenes was submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for analysis. DNA samples were collected, compared, run through databases. Forensic technicians worked around the clock, understanding that speed mattered, that somewhere out there a killer was walking free and potentially planning his next move. The biological evidence from Ripley's body was particularly crucial. The killer had left traces of himself at the scene, microscopic signatures that would, with the right technology and database matches, reveal his identity. On March 11, 2022, just a day after Levich's body was discovered, William Devonshire was arrested. The charges were almost mundane in their ordinariness: trespassing and drug possession. He had been spotted at Pioneer Park, a location he had previously been warned to stay away from, and when officers approached him, they found cocaine and drug paraphernalia on his person. These were minor offenses under normal circumstances, the kind of charges that might result in a fine, a few days in jail, probation for someone without an extensive criminal history. For Devonshire, however, they were catastrophic. As a convicted felon with a murder conviction in his background, he was required by law to provide a DNA sample upon arrest. It was routine procedure, a buccal swab that took seconds to complete and caused no physical discomfort. Devonshire complied willingly, even eagerly according to some reports, believing himself untouchable. He had killed twice in recent weeks and seemingly left no evidence that connected him to the crimes. He felt safe. He felt smart. He felt confident that he had outsmarted the investigators, that whatever forensic evidence they might have collected would lead nowhere. This was the fatal mistake that many criminals make: the assumption that they're smarter than the investigators, that their careful planning has covered every angle, that they can outsmart the combined resources of modern forensic science and determined detective work. Devonshire's arrogance would prove to be his undoing, the confidence that led him to voluntarily provide the very evidence that would seal his fate. The DNA sample was processed with urgent priority, given the active double homicide investigation. It was run through databases, compared to the evidence collected from Kellyanne Ripley's body during her autopsy. On March 28, 2022, the results came back, and they were unequivocal, scientifically certain beyond any reasonable doubt. William Devonshire's DNA matched the biological evidence from the first crime scene. The man who had bludgeoned Albert C. Harris Sr. to death nearly 20 years earlier in Delaware had killed again. And the evidence from the second crime scene, still being processed but showing promising initial results, would soon confirm what investigators already suspected. Vicki Levitch had fallen victim to the same killer. Interim Police Chief Rex Troche stood before the assembled media on March 28, 2022. The weight of two solved murders evident in his bearing, even as he delivered news of a suspect's arrest. The press conference room was crowded with reporters, cameras, and concerned citizens, all seeking answers to questions that had haunted Sarasota for more than a month. Troche announced that 52-year-old William Devonshire had been charged with the murder of Kellyanne Ripley and was a strong suspect in the death of Vicki Levitch. The relief in the room was palpable, mixed with anger that it had taken 2 deaths to identify the killer. The investigation had been a masterclass in modern police work, combining old-fashioned detective techniques with cutting-edge forensic science. Surveillance footage had captured Devonshire and Ripley together shortly before her death, his arm extending in a gesture that appeared to point toward the wooded area where she would be found. Cell phone data placed him at the right locations at the right times. Witnesses from the homeless community, once they understood that someone among them was a killer, had come forward with information about Devonshire's movements and behavior. And the DNA evidence provided irrefutable scientific proof that connected him to both crime scenes. Detective Maria Lovio described the interview she had conducted with Devonshire after his arrest. She characterized it as a cat-and-mouse game, with the suspect believing he was manipulating the investigators even as they built the case that would ensure his conviction. "We strongly believe that he felt very safe, that we were not looking at him," she explained to reporters. "I believe he felt he had covered his tracks very well, which is why we think he provided his DNA swab. His confidence had been his undoing, his arrogance the weapon that detectives used most effectively against him." For the families of Kellyanne Ripley and Vicki Levitch, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief that the killer had been caught before he could claim additional victims. There was satisfaction that the police had worked so diligently to solve the cases, that their loved ones had not been dismissed or forgotten because of their homeless status. But there was also profound anger that it had taken 2 murders to stop Devonshire, anger that a system which had known about his violent history had released him repeatedly, anger that their family members were dead because bureaucrats and parole boards had made catastrophic misjudgments about who deserved freedom. The Sarasota County Jail, where Devonshire was being held pending trial, is a modern detention facility designed to house defendants awaiting court proceedings and inmates serving shorter sentences. Devonshire occupied a cell among hundreds of other detainees, his particular case more serious than most, but his daily existence similar to theirs. Meals at scheduled times, limited recreation, the grinding monotony that characterizes incarceration. He had access to medical care, including medication for his epilepsy, a chronic condition that required daily pharmaceutical management to prevent seizures. William Devonshire refused to take his epilepsy medication. The refusal was documented by jail medical staff, who noted his non-compliance in their records. They explained to him repeatedly the risks associated with untreated epilepsy. Seizures could occur without warning. Falls during seizures could cause serious injury. Prolonged seizures could result in brain damage or death. Devonshire acknowledged these warnings and continued to refuse his medication. His reasons remain unclear and perhaps unknowable. Was it a deliberate choice, a form of control in an environment where he controlled nothing else? Was it depression or resignation, a recognition that his life as he had known it was over? Was it simply the same stubbornness that had characterized his interactions with authority throughout his entire life? On May 17, 2022, the consequences of his refusal manifested. Devonshire suffered a severe epileptic seizure in his jail cell. The convulsions caused him to lose control of his body, and he fell, striking his head on the unforgiving surfaces that define institutional architecture. The impact caused an intracerebral hemorrhage. Bleeding within the brain tissue itself, the kind of injury that requires immediate surgical intervention and even then carries a high mortality rate. Emergency medical personnel transported Devonshire to Sarasota Memorial Hospital, where neurosurgeons worked urgently to address the injury. They performed surgery to stop the bleeding and relieve pressure on the brain, employing all the techniques that modern neurosurgical practice makes available. The operation itself was technically successful in the sense that they accomplished their immediate surgical goals. But the injury was severe, the bleeding extensive, the damage to brain tissue significant. Even if Devonshire survived, the likelihood of meaningful recovery was minimal. Doctors consulted with Devonshire when he regained consciousness, explaining the extent of his injury and the prognosis. They consulted with jail medical staff about his ongoing refusal to take epilepsy medication. The clinical picture was clear. Given the severity of the brain injury and his continued refusal to take medication that might prevent future seizures, additional aggressive medical treatment would provide minimal benefit. He was what medical professionals delicately term a poor surgical candidate for further intervention. On May 27, 2022, William Devonshire was returned to the Sarasota County Jail and placed in the medical wing. He was provided with hospice care, that specialized form of medical support that acknowledges when cure is no longer possible and comfort becomes the primary goal. Hospice focuses on managing pain and symptoms, on providing dignity in death, on allowing people to die as peacefully as circumstances permit. For Devonshire, this meant medications to manage any discomfort, monitoring by medical staff, and the strange limbo of waiting for death in the same institution where he had been waiting for trial. For 9 days, William Devonshire lay dying in the medical wing of the Sarasota County Jail. The irony was not lost on anyone involved in the case. The man who had taken multiple lives violently would die without facing formal justice, would escape accountability through the most final means possible. He would never sit in a courtroom and hear the evidence against him presented piece by piece. He would never face the families of his victims and see the devastation he had caused reflected in their faces. He would never serve time for Ripley's and Levitch's murders, would never experience the long, slow punishment that society reserves for those who kill. On Sunday morning, June 5, 2022, William Jeffrey Devonshire died. He was 52 years old. The official cause of death was the intracerebral hemorrhage suffered during his epileptic seizure on May 17th, a seizure that might have been prevented or made less likely if he had taken the medication that was available to him. In a sense, he had contributed to his own death through negligent refusal of medical care, though whether this was deliberate self-destruction or simple stubbornness remains a question without a clear answer. The legal implications of his death were immediate and significant. In American criminal law, death terminates all criminal proceedings against a defendant. You cannot prosecute a corpse, cannot convict someone who is no longer alive to defend themselves or face punishment. The murder charge for Kelly and Ripley's death disappeared as if it had never existed. The anticipated charges for Vicki Levich's murder would never be filed. The cases were closed, but in the worst possible way. Closed because the defendant could no longer be prosecuted, not because justice had been served. On June 6, 2022, the Sarasota Police Department held a press conference to announce Devonshire's death and provide closure to a community that had been terrorized by his crimes. Captain Jonathan Todd addressed the media with a statement that was both frustrating and satisfying. We had indisputable evidence that linked Devonshire to both homicides that occurred in February and March. The DNA evidence was conclusive, scientifically certain. Levich's DNA had been found on Devonshire's clothing. His DNA had been found on branches used to conceal her body. Had he lived to stand trial, conviction was virtually certain. Detective Kim Laster explained the sequence of events that led to Devonshire's death. The refusal of medication, the seizure, the fall, the brain injury, the hospice care. Her voice carried both frustration and acceptance. Frustration that justice would not be formally served. Acceptance that sometimes cases end in ways that no one anticipates or desires. For the families of the victims, Devonshire's death brought a form of closure, but not the kind that comes with justice properly served. They would never have their day in court, would never see him convicted, would never have the opportunity to provide victim impact statements explaining what he had taken from them. The closure was incomplete, unsatisfying, the ending to a story that deserved better. Within the homeless community around Sarasota, the news of Devonshire's death brought mixed reactions. The immediate threat was gone, removed not by justice but by medical circumstances. People could return to familiar areas, could walk the paths they had avoided during the fearful weeks when a killer moved among them. But the underlying vulnerability remained. Being homeless still meant being exposed to dangers that the housed population rarely faces, still meant being targets for those who view marginalized people as easy victims. The broader questions raised by the case remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. How do we balance rehabilitation and punishment in our criminal justice system? At what point does someone's history of violence indicate that they should never be released back into society? How do we protect vulnerable populations from predators who specifically target them? What responsibility do parole boards bear when their release decisions prove catastrophic? These questions have no easy answers, no simple solutions that would prevent all future tragedies. Private investigators and crime analysts began examining cold cases in jurisdictions where Devonshire had lived and been arrested. His 3 known murders, Albert C. Harris Sr. in Delaware, Kelly and Ripley and Vicki Levich in Florida, represented only the crimes that could be proven. His decades-long pattern of violence, particularly against women, suggested there might be others. Investigators looked at unsolved murders of vulnerable individuals in Delaware, Maryland, Indiana, Ohio, New Jersey, and Florida, trying to determine if any might be connected to Devonshire through DNA evidence or circumstantial factors. The systemic failures that allowed Devonshire to kill again were stark and deeply troubling. A man convicted of murder in 2005 had been released after serving only 8 years. Upon release, he had immediately moved to Florida and within days attacked a woman. That 2013 attack resulted in a battery charge, but not in enhanced scrutiny of a recently paroled murderer. The 2015 strangulation and kidnapping case, where he explicitly referenced his prior murder, was dropped by prosecutors. Each decision point represented an opportunity for intervention that was missed or ignored. The question, how many chances does one person deserve, haunted everyone involved in the case. Devonshire had been arrested more than 70 times across 6 states. He had murdered a man and served less than a decade. He had attacked women repeatedly. He had threatened to kill again. And yet, time after time, he was released, given another opportunity, another chance to prove himself capable of living in society without causing harm. Each release represented a belief, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, that rehabilitation was possible, that people can change, that past violence doesn't necessarily predict future violence. But William Devonshire had not changed. The violence that characterized his teenage years had followed him through adulthood, escalating gradually from assault to murder, from single victims to serial killing. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it, but the system that should have protected society from him had failed repeatedly and catastrophically. Memorials appeared at the locations where Ripley's and Levich's bodies had been found. Temporary shrines with flowers and candles and handwritten notes from people who had known them or simply wanted to acknowledge that their lives had mattered. These informal memorials are a tradition in communities touched by violence, a way for people to express grief and solidarity when formal mourning spaces don't exist. They stood for weeks, slowly weathering under Florida's sun and rain, physical reminders of lives cut short and a killer who had moved among the vulnerable until he couldn't anymore. In the end, darkness walked among the vulnerable in Sarasota for years before being contained. Killed 3 people that we know of, possibly more that we don't. It was created gradually over decades, fed by repeated releases and insufficient consequences, enabled by a system that could not or would not see what should have been obvious. And when it finally ended, it did so not through justice but through the killer's own refusal to take medication that might have prevented his death, leaving behind questions that will never be fully answered in victims who deserved so much better than what they got. Some men carry darkness so quietly that it moves beside them like a second skin. William Devonshire was one of those men, and the trail of destruction he left behind stands as testimony to what happens when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members from those who view them not as human beings, but as opportunities for violence. The story is over, but its lessons remain, waiting to be learned or ignored as we choose. The names Kelly and Ripley and Vicky Levitch deserve to be remembered not merely as victims, but as people whose deaths might have been prevented if the system designed to protect them had functioned as it should have. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.